Tonight, we're going somewhere vast. Not a single battle, not a single Tsar, not a single ship, but an entire world of ocean, river, ice and ambition, stretching across more than 1,000 years of human history. The story you're about to hear is the complete history of the Russian Navy, and it is one of the most unlikely, dramatic and deeply human stories that has ever unfolded on the water. This is a sleep story, which means you are invited to let it wash over you, to close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the centuries drift past like dark water beneath a ship's hull. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You need only listen and let the images come. Long wooden ships being dragged overland across frozen forests, cannon fire splitting the night sky over the Black Sea, submarines creeping silently beneath the Arctic ice, admirals who never lost a battle, a navy that was built from nothing, sunk, rebuilt, exiled, revolutionized and rebuilt again. Russia is an enormous land, the largest country on Earth, and yet for most of its history it was essentially landlocked in the ways that mattered most. It had no warm water port that faced the open ocean. It was ringed by hostile powers who held the coastlines, who commanded the straits, who controlled the trade routes. And so, from the very earliest days of the Russian state, the desire for the sea, a burning, almost desperate desire, has driven Tsars and emperors and Soviet premiers to extraordinary lengths. Wars were fought not for land, but for a harbour. Empires were built around the logic of a single warm water port. Men died by the tens of thousands so that a fleet could sail freely into the Mediterranean, into the Pacific, into the Arctic Ocean. We will begin at the very beginning, in the deep, quiet forests and rivers of medieval Rus, where the ancestors of the Russian state first learned to move on water. We will travel through the humiliations and dreams of the early Tsars, through the extraordinary volcanic energy of Peter the Great, who dragged Russia into the modern age through sheer force of will, and built an entire navy almost entirely with his own hands. We will follow the fleet through the golden age of Catherine the Great, through the age of the great admirals who sailed under the imperial eagle and never surrendered a ship in battle. We will sit with the sailors at Sevastopol as the city fell, as the old wooden fleet was scuttled at the harbour entrance to block the British and French, and as an entire era came to a quiet, mournful end. Then we will trace the long, painful rebuilding, the ironclads, the debates, the strange experiments with circular ships, before we arrive at one of the most heartbreaking voyages in naval history, the story of the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, which sailed 18,000 miles from the Baltic Sea all the way around the coast of Africa and Asia, only to be annihilated in a single afternoon in the Strait of Tsushima. We will move through the revolution, through the sailors who became the fiercest fighters of the new Soviet state, through the Second World War and the submarines and the Arctic convoys, and finally into the cold, tense depths of the Cold War, where Russian and American submarines played a decades-long game of cat and mouse beneath the surface of every ocean on Earth. It is a story of ambition and catastrophe, of brilliance and tragedy, of men who loved the sea so much they died for it, and men who hated the sea but went to it anyway because their Tsar commanded it. It is a story that is still unfolding in the Black Sea, in the Arctic, in the quiet calculations of admirals who are right now, tonight, watching the water. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let the world above the surface grow distant. We're going down into history, and the water is very deep. Long before there was a Russia, there were rivers, enormous, slow, brown rivers uncoiling through the vast plain of what would one day become the largest nation on Earth. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, the Dvina, the Neva. These were the arteries of civilization in this part of the world, the roads along which people moved, traded, raided, and built their lives. And the people who lived along these rivers learned very early that mastering water meant mastering everything. The earliest Slavic peoples of the region were farmers and fishermen and craftsmen, but they were not, in any organised sense, sailors. The sea was distant, the rivers were near, and the rivers were enough. They built dugout canoes and flat-bottomed boats that could carry grain and furs and amber down to the great trading cities of the south. But then, in the 9th century, something changed. Newcomers arrived from the north, men who knew the sea the way other men knew their own heartbeats. the Varangians, the Vikings of the East. These were Norse warriors and traders who had discovered that the rivers of the eastern plain led eventually to something extraordinary, to Constantinople, the greatest city in the medieval world, and to the Silk Roads of Asia beyond. They came down from Scandinavia in their long, shallow drafted ships, their dragon-prowed vessels that could be carried overland between river systems, that drew so little water they could float in streams a man could wade across. They established trading posts and fortifications at key points along the rivers, Novgorod in the north, Kiev in the south, and in doing so they created the political entity that historians call Kievan Rus. These Varangian chieftains and their Slavic subjects developed a river-based civilization that was, in a very real sense, a maritime civilization in miniature. They knew how to read water. They knew how to build boats that could survive the fierce rapids of the Dnieper. They knew how to navigate by stars and by the colour of the current, how to portage their ships over land when necessary, how to organise raiding fleets of hundreds of vessels for the great campaigns against Byzantium. The raids on Constantinople, or Zagreb, as the Slavs called it, the imperial city, are among the most dramatic episodes of early medieval history, and they are, in a sense, the very first chapter in the story of Russian naval power. The earliest recorded raid came in the year 860, when a fleet of what Byzantine sources describe as 200 ships appeared suddenly in the Bosphorus and attacked the city. The emperor was away on campaign. The city had no warning. The raiders plundered the suburbs, terrorised the population, and then vanished back into the waters to the north. Who exactly these raiders were is still debated. Some historians see them as early Rus, some as Varangians, some as a mixture of both. But what matters for our story is the pattern they established. For nearly a century, the people of Kievan Rus launched periodic naval expeditions down the Dnieper, across the Black Sea, which they called the Rus Sea, and against the walls of the greatest city in Christendom. They travelled in monoxilla, dug out canoes, sometimes enlarged with added planking, paddled by crews of warriors who functioned equally well as soldiers on land or sailors on water. The campaign of 941 was the most ambitious. Prince Igor of Kiev led a fleet that Byzantine sources, probably exaggerating for effect but perhaps not entirely, put at 10,000 ships. The reality was certainly far smaller, but the force was substantial enough to devastate the Bithynian coast of Asia Minor and to threaten Constantinople itself. What stopped Igor was not the Byzantine army but the Byzantine navy, and specifically the terrifying weapon they deployed from their ships: Greek fire. Greek fire was one of the great military secrets of the medieval world, a flammable liquid that burned on water that could not be extinguished by ordinary means, projected through bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships. Igor's fleet, his hundreds or thousands of wooden vessels packed with warriors, met the Byzantine fireships and was devastated. The Rus who survived and made it back to their own shores told stories of ships that burned on the water as if the sea itself were on fire. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten, that naval warfare was not just about the men on the ships, but about the technology of the ships themselves. A generation later, Prince Sviatoslav conducted campaigns deep into Bulgaria and toward Byzantium that included significant naval components, and his successor, Vladimir the Great, who converted Kievan Rus to Christianity in 988, maintained a close relationship with Byzantine naval power through diplomacy rather than conflict. The Varangian Guard, the Norse and Rus warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguard in Constantinople, were recruited in part because of their demonstrated military prowess, including their ability to fight at sea. Then, in the 13th century, everything ended. The Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1242 swept across Kievan Rus like a fire across dry grass. Cities were burned, populations were massacred or enslaved. The sophisticated river-trading civilization that had developed over 3 centuries was shattered. Kiev itself, once one of the great cities of Europe, was left a ruin inhabited by fewer than 200 people. And with the destruction of the Kievan state went the accumulated knowledge, the shipbuilding traditions, the naval organization that had made the Rus a power on the water. For the next 2 centuries and more, the Russian lands were subject territories of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the steppe and extracted tribute from the forest principalities to the north. The rivers remained, of course, and people still moved on them, still fished and traded and occasionally fought. But organised naval power, the kind that could project force across the Black Sea, was gone. The sea itself drifted away from Russian consciousness, becoming something distant and foreign, something that belonged to other peoples. The principality that eventually emerged as the dominant power in this fragmented world was Moscow, not a maritime city, not a river city in any grand sense, but an inland fortress town that grew rich on the fur trade and the patronage of the Orthodox Church. The Grand Princes of Moscow were not sailors. They were cavalry commanders, administrators, political operators who played the Mongol overlords against each other with extraordinary patience and skill. The sea was not in their calculations, at least not yet, but the sea was waiting. And the man who would finally force Russia to confront it, at terrible cost, with furious energy and with results that would echo down through the centuries, was still generations away. Before him, though, there was another Tsar, a terrible one. Ivan the Fourth. Ivan the Terrible, as history has named him, though a more precise translation of the Russian epithet might be Ivan the Formidable, or even the Fearsome, came to power in 1547 as the first Tsar of all Russia. He was brilliant and paranoid, visionary and cruel, a man whose reign created much of what we would recognise as the Russian state, and who ended it bathed in the blood of people he had loved, including, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, his own son and heir. Ivan understood, as his predecessors had begun to understand, that Russia was being strangled by its geography. To the east he could expand, and he did spectacularly, sending the Cossack leader Yermak Timofeyevich on the campaign that began Russia's conquest of Siberia. A process that would eventually give Russia access to the Pacific Ocean, but that would take another century to fully develop. To the south, the Crimean Tatars and the Ottoman Empire blocked access to the Black Sea. To the west, the Baltic Sea, the gateway to the maritime nations of Western Europe, to the trade routes that connected Russia to the wealth of the wider world, was controlled by the Livonian Order, a remnant crusading state that had held the eastern Baltic coast for 3 centuries. Ivan decided to go west. The Livonian War, which began in 1558 and would drag on for 25 years in various forms, was fundamentally a war for access to the Baltic Sea. Ivan wanted a window onto the ocean. He wanted Russian merchants to be able to trade directly with England and the Netherlands and the Hanseatic cities without passing through intermediaries. He wanted the ability to hire European military engineers and craftsmen without the permission of those who controlled the ports. He wanted, in a word, to be a maritime power. In the early years, the Livonian War went brilliantly. Ivan's army swept through the crumbling Livonian Confederation, capturing the major cities, sending terrified nobles fleeing westward with tales of Muscovite barbarism that were sometimes exaggerated and sometimes, given what we know of Ivan's campaigns, entirely accurate. For a moment it seemed as though Russia might achieve what Ivan wanted, a permanent foothold on the Baltic coast, a real naval presence on the sea that mattered most to European commerce. But the war quickly became something far more complicated. Sweden, Poland, Lithuania and Denmark all had their own interests in the Baltic, and none of them were willing to allow a resurgent Russia to establish itself on the coast. The conflict that had begun as a war against the Livonian Order transformed into a coalition war against multiple great powers simultaneously, and this was a war that Ivan could not win. The later years of the conflict saw Russian armies pushed back, territory lost, and the dream of a Baltic port receding into the distance. There were naval dimensions to this war, though they are often overshadowed by the land campaigns. Ivan attempted to create a privateering fleet in the Baltic, commissioning a Danish adventurer named Carsten Rode to operate against Polish and Swedish shipping. Rode was moderately successful. He captured several dozen vessels and disrupted trade routes for a time, but his operations were more piracy than naval warfare in any organised sense, and they ended when he was arrested by Danish authorities in 1570. The episode reveals both Ivan's ambitions and his limitations. He understood the potential of sea power, but he lacked the institutional foundations, the shipbuilding capacity, and the trained naval officers to build anything durable. The Livonian War ended in 1583 with the Peace of Plusa, which left Russia essentially where it had started, without a Baltic coastline. Ivan's attempt to force open a window to the west had failed. He died the following year, leaving behind a state that was powerful but fundamentally cut off from the maritime world that was reshaping the global order. There was one place where Russia touched the ocean, the White Sea, in the far north, where the port of Arkhangelsk, founded in 1584, the year of Ivan's death, provided a tenuous link to the outside world. English merchants had discovered this route in 1553, when the navigator Richard Chancellor, searching for a northeast passage to Asia, had sailed into the White Sea and made his way overland to Moscow, where he was received by Ivan himself with lavish hospitality. The result was the founding of the Muscovy Company, which conducted a profitable trade between England and Russia through Arkhangelsk for the next century and a half. But Arkhangelsk was not a real answer to Russia's geographic problem. The White Sea was frozen for 6 months of the year. The route to it from Western Europe was long and dangerous. The port was so far from the centres of Russian power that the overland journey from Moscow took weeks. It was a lifeline, but a thin and unreliable one, a reminder of isolation rather than a solution to it. The solution would not come for another century. It would come from a man who had already decided before he was fully grown that Russia's destiny lay on the water, and who would dedicate his entire formidable life to making that destiny real. He was born in 1672, the 14th child of Tsar Alexis, and his name was Peter. The story of how Peter the Great fell in love with the sea is one of the most charming origin stories in all of Russian history, and it has the particular quality of being at its core almost certainly true. In 1688, the 16-year-old Peter, already nearly 7 feet tall, already possessed of the tireless physical energy and relentless curiosity that would define his reign, discovered an old English sailing boat in a storage shed on the estate of a family friend near Moscow. The boat was in poor repair, but it was something that Russian craft of the period were not. It could sail against the wind, could tack and beat into a headwind, could move independently of the current. Peter was fascinated. He found a Dutch craftsman named Karsten Brandt who had sailed to Russia years earlier and who understood how such vessels worked, and together they restored the boat, which Peter called the grandfather of the Russian Navy, a title it still holds, and the vessel itself is still preserved in a museum in St. Petersburg. Peter sailed it on the Yauza River near Moscow, and then on larger lakes, and each time the wind filled the sails and the boat heeled gracefully to one side, something in the young Tsar's heart opened that would never fully close again. This was not just a hobby. Peter was a person who experienced ideas physically, who needed to touch and build and operate things himself before he truly understood them. He would spend his life doing this, working as a carpenter in Dutch shipyards, serving as an ordinary sailor on his own warships, pulling on ropes and wielding an axe alongside men who did not initially know who he was. He was the only Tsar who truly understood seamanship from the bottom up, who knew in his muscles as well as his mind what it meant to sail a ship, and this understanding shaped everything he built. Peter came to sole power in 1696, following years of political struggle and the death of his co-Tsar Ivan V. His first major act of policy was military, and it was directed at the south, at the Ottoman fortress of Azov, which guarded the mouth of the Don River and the gateway to the Black Sea. A first attempt to take Azov in 1695 had failed because Peter had no ships. His army could besiege the fortress from the land, but Ottoman supply ships could simply sail in from the sea and relieve the garrison at will. Peter's response to this failure was characteristic. He would build a fleet. Working through the winter of 1695 to 1696 in the forests and shipyards of Voronezh on the Don River, he organised the construction of a naval force that was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable achievement. In a matter of months, Russian workers, supervised by foreign experts and by Peter himself, who worked alongside them with an axe and an adze, produced 2 warships, 23 galleys, 4 fireships, and over 1,000 smaller craft. The speed of construction meant that the quality was sometimes questionable, and the ships sometimes leaked alarmingly, but there were enough of them, and they were enough. The second Azov campaign of 1696 succeeded where the first had failed. The Russian fleet blockaded the fortress from the sea, cutting off its supply lines, while the army besieged it from the land. The Ottoman garrison, starved and without hope of relief, surrendered. Peter had his first southern foothold, and Russia had, for the first time in its history, something that could reasonably be called a navy. It was a small, rough, river-built navy, but it floated and it fought. And that was enough to give Peter a glimpse of what might be possible. Peter's response to the victory at Azov was not to rest, but to intensify. He had won a fortress on the water. Now he needed to understand water properly. In 1697 and 1698, he undertook one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of monarchy, the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic mission to Western Europe in which Peter travelled incognito, though his 6.5-foot frame and restless energy made anonymity essentially impossible, to study everything that Europe could teach him about ships, navigation, fortification, industry and statecraft. He spent 4 months working in the shipyards of the Dutch East India Company at Zaandam and Amsterdam, living in a worker's cottage, eating simple food, rising before dawn to work alongside the carpenters and caulkers. He visited foundries and arsenal. He inspected the great naval establishment at Amsterdam, where he was given a warship to oversee the construction of so that he could learn every stage of the process firsthand. He travelled to England, where King William III gave him the use of the Royal Navy's facilities at Deptford, and where he spent 3 months studying English shipbuilding techniques, which he considered superior to the Dutch. He visited the Greenwich Observatory, where he met the astronomer Royal Edmund Halley of the Comet, and discussed navigation and celestial mechanics. He visited the Tower of London, the arsenals, the docks. He hired hundreds of specialists, shipwrights, navigators, gunners, doctors, engineers, and sent them back to Russia ahead of him. He was building not just a fleet, but an entire maritime civilization, assembled piece by piece from the best that Europe had to offer, to be transplanted onto Russian soil. The Great Northern War, which began in 1700 and would last for 21 years, gave Peter the opportunity to pursue the ambition that had been building in him since the days of the little English sailboat in the storage shed. The war was, at its core, a struggle for control of the Baltic Sea coast, for the access to the ocean that Russia had been denied since the failure of Ivan's Livonian War a century and a half earlier. The early years of the war were catastrophic. At Narva in 1700, a Swedish army under the young King Charles XII, one of the most gifted military commanders of his era, destroyed a Russian force 3 times its size in a matter of hours. The Russian army lost all its artillery, all its senior commanders, and most of its men. It was a humiliation that seemed to prove what many Europeans had always believed, that Russia was not a real military power, that it could not compete with the disciplined armies of the West. Peter refused to be defined by Narva. He melted down church bells to cast new cannon. He reformed the army, hiring foreign officers and instituting rigorous training. And while he rebuilt his land forces, he also pushed the construction of a navy, not on the Don or the Volga, but on the Baltic itself, in the very mouth of the Neva River, in territory that had been Swedish since the early 17th century, but which Peter had seized in the opening moves of the war. In 1703, Peter founded St. Petersburg on a marshy delta at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland. The choice was extraordinary and revealing. This was not a strategic location for a capital city by any conventional measure. It was swampy, unhealthy, prone to flooding, and separated from the Russian heartland by vast distances. Tens of thousands of workers died building it, driven to their deaths by the impossible conditions and Peter's implacable will. But it was on the water, on the Baltic, Russia's long-desired Western Sea, and it gave Russia a naval base from which to project power into the most commercially and strategically important body of water in Europe. The Admiralty, built on the Neva's south bank in 1704, was the heart of the new naval establishment, a shipyard and administrative centre from which Peter commanded the construction of a fleet that grew, year by year, from a handful of small vessels into a force capable of challenging Swedish supremacy on the Baltic. The golden spire of the Admiralty building, topped with a weather vane in the shape of a sailing ship, became one of the defining symbols of the new city, and it remains to this day one of the landmarks of what is now called St. Petersburg. The moment when Russia announced itself as a genuine naval power came on July 27, 1714, at the Battle of Gangut, fought in the narrow waters off the southern coast of Finland. A Swedish naval squadron under Vice Admiral Ehrenskjöld consisting of 1 frigate, 6 galleys, and 3 smaller vessels, was attempting to block the passage of a Russian galley fleet of 99 vessels carrying troops for operations in Finland. The Swedish ships were becalmed. The wind had died, and without wind the sailing warships were helpless. Peter seized the moment. His galleys, powered by oars rather than wind, could manoeuvre freely in the calm. He ordered a direct attack, and after a fierce battle in which the Swedish commander fought with great courage and his flagship was surrounded from 3 sides, Ehrenskjold surrendered. All 11 Swedish vessels were captured. It was the first significant naval victory in Russian history, and Peter treated it with the ceremony it deserved, staging a triumphal procession in St. Petersburg in which the captured Swedish ships were paraded in front of cheering crowds. The war continued for 7 more years before the Treaty of Nystad in 1721 finally settled the account. Sweden ceded the Baltic provinces, Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, part of Karelia, to Russia. The window to the west that Ivan the Terrible had failed to force open a century and a half earlier was now open, and it was open permanently. Russia had the Baltic coast, it had a navy, and it had a new capital city that was itself a monument to maritime ambition. Peter celebrated by proclaiming Russia an empire and accepting from the Senate the titles Father of the Fatherland and Peter the Great. He was 50 years old. He had 17 more years to live, and he spent them building. By the time of Peter's death in 1725, the Russian navy consisted of 48 ships of the line, 800 smaller vessels, and 28,000 sailors and officers. This was not a fleet assembled from tradition and gradual development. It had been built in less than 30 years, largely through the effort of one man's will. The officers were a mixture of foreigners and Russians who had been sent abroad to learn their trade. The sailors were mostly conscripted peasants who had often never seen the sea before they were pressed into service. The ships were built to Dutch and English designs, in yards that had been established and supervised by imported experts. It was in some ways a fragile thing, dependent on continued foreign expertise, on political will at the top, on the infrastructure of a naval culture that had not yet fully taken root in Russian society. But it was real, and it floated, and it fought. Peter had done something that most of his contemporaries had thought impossible. He had taken a landlocked medieval state and turned it, within a single lifetime, into a naval power. He died in February 1725, apparently of complications from a urinary tract infection, perhaps worsened by the cold he caught while wading into the Gulf of Finland to help rescue sailors from a grounded boat. It was, for Peter, a characteristically physical death. The man who had spent his life in the water died, in the end, from the water. He was buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, within sight of the river he had built his empire around. The rulers who followed Peter the Great were, almost without exception, deeply aware that they were living in his shadow. His daughter Elizabeth, his grandson Peter III, his German-born daughter-in-law Catherine II, all of them governed in explicit reference to Peter's legacy. All of them understood that the navy was one of the defining achievements of his reign, and all of them, to varying degrees, continued the project he had started. But the mid-18th century was also a period in which the Russian navy sometimes drifted without clear purpose, a powerful force that lacked, in some periods, the strategic direction and political will to use it effectively. The decades after Peter's death saw the navy fall into relative neglect under some of his immediate successors, who were more interested in court politics than in seamanship. Ships rotted in harbour for lack of maintenance. Foreign officers who had come to Russia under Peter's generous recruiting found their positions becoming precarious in an atmosphere of growing Russian nationalism that viewed foreign expertise with suspicion. The ambitious projects that Peter had dreamed of, a Russian presence in the Mediterranean, a trade route to Asia around the north of Siberia, were set aside in favour of more immediately pressing concerns. But the institutional foundations held, and when a ruler came along who combined political genius with genuine strategic vision, the navy was there to serve those ambitions. That ruler was Catherine II, who came to power in 1762 and who would rule for 34 years, transforming Russia into one of the great powers of Europe and the navy into one of the instruments of that transformation. Catherine II was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess who came to Russia as a teenager to marry the heir to the Russian throne. Her husband, Peter III, was erratic and unpopular. Catherine was brilliant, charming, and utterly determined. When Peter III was overthrown and murdered, Catherine's precise involvement remains historically murky. She became empress at the age of 33 and proceeded to govern Russia for over 3 decades with a combination of Enlightenment political philosophy and hard-nosed realpolitik that left her contemporaries frequently astonished. Catherine's great naval ambition lay in the south, in the Black Sea and beyond it, in the Mediterranean, in the Ottoman Empire, which she intended to dismantle, or at least diminish. Her goal was nothing less than to restore a Christian empire in Constantinople, the ancient capital of Byzantium. She called this the Greek project, and while it was ultimately too ambitious to be realized, the naval operations it generated were among the most remarkable of the 18th century. The First Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 provided the occasion for one of the most audacious naval operations in Russian history. In 1769, Catherine dispatched a squadron of warships from the Baltic Fleet on a voyage around the whole of Europe, through the North Sea, around the coast of England and France, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean. The aim was to reach the Ottoman coast, to stir up rebellion among the Greek and Slavic populations of the empire, and to attack Ottoman sea power at its source. The expedition was commanded by Count Alexei Orlov, a court favourite whose qualifications for naval command were somewhat limited, but whose energy and political connections more than compensated. With him were several experienced naval officers, including the Scottish-born Samuel Grieg, who had entered Russian service and who would prove to be one of the most capable sea officers Russia ever produced. The voyage was difficult. The Baltic ships were not well suited to Atlantic conditions. Disease ravaged the crews, and the expected Greek uprising proved less enthusiastic than Catherine had hoped. But the squadron arrived in the eastern Mediterranean in the spring of 1770 and began operations against Ottoman shipping and coastal towns. What happened next is one of the most spectacular naval engagements of the 18th century. The Russian fleet encountered the main Ottoman fleet in the Aegean Sea, and after an inconclusive engagement in the Straits of Chios on July 5, 1770, the two fleets fought again the following night in the narrow waters of the Bay of Chesma, on the coast of Anatolia. The Ottoman fleet trapped in the bay was set upon by Russian fireships, small vessels packed with combustible material, and sailed into the enemy formation by volunteers who then jumped overboard and swam for their lives. The results were apocalyptic. The Ottoman fleet, packed together in the confined space of the bay, caught fire, and the fire spread from ship to ship with terrible speed. By morning, 11 battleships, 6 frigates, and 50 smaller vessels had been destroyed or sunk. Somewhere between 8,000 and 11,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers died. The Russian fleet had lost 1 ship and a handful of men. The Battle of Chesma, or Cheshme, in Turkish, was a catastrophe for Ottoman naval power and a triumph that echoed across Europe. Frederick the Great of Prussia called it the most important naval battle of the century. The monument Catherine erected to Chesma is still standing in the park at Tsarskoye Selo, her summer palace outside St. Petersburg. It takes the form of a column rising from an artificial lake, topped with an eagle, the imperial eagle of Russia, triumphant over the sea that had once seemed so far away. Catherine had made the Mediterranean a Russian lake, at least for a moment, and the world had noticed. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, which ended the First Russo-Turkish War in 1774, gave Russia something even more valuable than battlefield glory. It gave Russia the right to sail warships on the Black Sea and through the Straits. For the first time since the days of Kievan Rus, Russian ships could legally operate in the Southern Sea, the sea of ancient ambition. Catherine moved quickly to consolidate this gain, and in 1783 she annexed the Crimean Peninsula, the fortress of the Black Sea, and began building a new naval base at the deep-water harbour of Sevastopol. Sevastopol would become one of the most important places in Russian naval history, a city whose name would be written in fire and blood more than once in the centuries to come, a harbour so perfectly suited to naval purposes that both the Russians and their enemies understood its strategic value immediately. The water of Sevastopol Bay was deep. The entrance was narrow and defensible, The hills above provided commanding positions for artillery. It was, in the judgment of military men across 2 centuries, one of the finest natural harbours in the world, and Russia had it now. The founding of the Black Sea Fleet in 1783 gave Russia a second great naval force to complement the Baltic Fleet, a force that could operate in warmer waters, in closer proximity to the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean, in the sea that had haunted Russian ambitions since the days of Ivan the Terrible. The man appointed to organise and lead this new fleet would prove to be one of the greatest naval commanders Russia ever produced. Fyodor Fyodorovich Ushakov is not a name that most Western readers would recognise, but in Russia he is remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in history, a man who fought 30 naval battles and never lost one, who never had a ship sunk under his command, who was canonised as a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church in 2001 for his humility, his care for his sailors, and his mercy toward defeated enemies. He is, in many ways, the Nelson of Russia, though the comparison undersells him. He predates Nelson's greatest victories, achieved results that Nelson never matched, and did it all without the benefit of the institutional naval tradition that the Royal Navy had accumulated over 2 centuries. Ushakov was born in 1745 to a minor noble family in the Yaroslavl region, far from the sea, and he entered the naval service as a young officer in the newly founded Black Sea Fleet. He served in the Second Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, and it was here that he began to develop the tactical innovations that would make him legendary. Ushakov rejected the rigid line of battle tactics that dominated 18th century naval warfare. The convention that opposing fleets should form into parallel lines and exchange broadsides at close range until one side was battered into submission. Instead, he trained his captains to act with independence and initiative, to concentrate fire on the enemy flagship to destroy the opponent's command structure, to close aggressively to short range where the accuracy of his better trained gunners could be decisive. His first great victory came at the Battle of Tendra in August 1790, when his fleet of 10 ships of the line and 6 frigates encountered a larger Ottoman force in the Black Sea off the coast of what is now Ukraine. Ushakov attacked immediately, without forming his fleet into the customary line, a move that shocked both the Ottomans and his own officers, who had been trained to expect a more formal engagement. The Ottoman fleet broke and fled. 2 ships of the line were captured, several more were sunk, and the Ottoman naval commander barely escaped with his life. The most extraordinary chapter of Ushakov's career came not in the Black Sea, but in the Mediterranean, and not in a war against the Ottomans, but in a campaign fought, remarkably, in alliance with them. The French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power had scrambled the alignments of European politics, and in 1798, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and threatened the Ottoman Empire's North African territories, Sultan Selim III turned to the very power he had fought for so many years and asked Russia for help. Catherine's successor, Paul I, agreed, and Ushakov was dispatched with a fleet of 6 ships of the line, 7 frigates, and 3 smaller vessels to operate in the eastern Mediterranean alongside Ottoman warships. The target was the Ionian Islands, a chain of islands off the western coast of Greece that the French had occupied following the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. Napoleon considered them strategically important. Ushakov agreed, and proceeded to take them one by one with a combination of naval bombardment and amphibious assault. The climax came at Corfu, the largest and most strongly fortified of the islands, in the spring of 1799. The fortress of Corfu was considered by military engineers to be nearly impregnable from the sea. It occupied a small island just off the main harbour, its walls were thick and well armed, and the garrison of approximately 3,000 French soldiers was well supplied and determined to resist. Ushakov spent weeks studying the problem, consulting with his captains, and preparing a plan that involved simultaneous attack from multiple directions. When he struck, on March 2nd, 1799, the combined Russian-Ottoman force overwhelmed the outer fortifications in a single assault and forced the French garrison to surrender the following day. It was a remarkable achievement, and it was accomplished with minimal casualties on the attacking side. Ushakov's treatment of the defeated French garrison became famous across Europe. He refused to allow looting. He ensured that the French soldiers were treated as prisoners of war, according to the customs of civilized nations. He organized the relief of civilians who had suffered during the siege, Napoleon, who had been watching the campaign from Egypt, reportedly said that Ushakov was a man of great talent and that France had lost a fine general when Russia kept him an admiral. It was, from Napoleon, an extraordinary compliment. Ushakov returned to Russia in 1800, having accomplished everything that had been asked of him and more. He was received with honours and promoted, but the political atmosphere at court was changing. Paul I was assassinated in 1801 and replaced by Alexander I, who had different advisers and different priorities. Ushakov found himself increasingly marginalised, assigned to administrative tasks that made little use of his genius, and he spent the last decade of his active service in frustration. He retired to his estate in 1807 and spent the remainder of his life in prayer, study and charity, giving away much of his fortune to care for veterans wounded in the wars he had fought and to support orphans and the destitute of his region. He died in 1817, quiet and largely forgotten by the court that had once celebrated him. He was 72 years old, and he had never lost a battle, never lost a ship, never surrendered. The Russian Orthodox Church, recognizing in his humility and mercy something beyond mere military excellence, declared him a saint 2 centuries after his birth. His feast day is celebrated on October 15th. The story of Ushakov points towards something important about the Russian naval tradition. Its greatest figures have consistently been men who achieved their results through tactical innovation and the development of their subordinates, rather than through sheer material superiority. The Russian Navy has rarely been the richest, the most technically advanced, or the best supplied fleet in any conflict it has entered. What it has sometimes had, at its best, is commanders of genius and sailors of remarkable tenacity. Ushakov was the first great exemplar of this tradition, and he would not be the last. The wars of Napoleon had given the Russian Navy a complicated role. At Trafalgar in 1805, the Franco-Spanish fleet that was destroyed by Nelson included a small Russian squadron, or rather Russia was so peripheral to that engagement that its ships were elsewhere entirely, operating in the Mediterranean under Senyavin in what turned out to be a highly successful campaign against the French in the Adriatic. The Russian fleet under Dmitry Senyavin fought its own Trafalgar in the Aegean in 1807, defeating an Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Athos with the kind of aggressive, concentrated tactics that Ushakov had pioneered. But the subsequent politics of the Napoleonic Wars, which forced a temporary Russian-French alliance under the Treaty of Tilsit, left Senyavin's fleet stranded in the Mediterranean, ultimately interned by the British, and the admiral himself returned to Russia in diminished circumstances. The generation of admirals who built the Black Sea Fleet in the 1820s and 1830s were formed in this complex, often frustrating world of great power politics and uncertain naval purpose. The dominant figure of this generation was Mikhail Lazarev, a man of extraordinary range, explorer, navigator, tactician, administrator and teacher. Lazarev had sailed around the world twice, had participated in the discovery of Antarctica in 1820, an achievement that Russia shares credit for with British and American explorers, and had commanded a ship at the Battle of Navarino in 1827, where a combined British, French and Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian naval force in the last great battle of the Age of Sail. Among Lazarev's most gifted pupils was Pavel Nakhimov, who would become the most celebrated naval officer in Russian history between Ushakov and the 20th century. Nakhimov was a quiet, intense, deeply serious man who had no interests outside the navy, no estates, no family of his own, no hobbies beyond seamanship. He lived on his ships with his sailors, knew them personally, cared for their welfare with a paternalism that won him extraordinary loyalty. His sailors called him Father Pavel, and the name expressed something real. He considered their lives and well-being his personal responsibility in a way that was unusual for the time. As a captain and then a rear admiral in the Black Sea Fleet, Nakhimov developed a reputation for meticulous preparation and aggressive execution. He drilled his crews until they could perform complex maneuvers in darkness or heavy weather, until the gunners could maintain a rate of fire that would have been considered extraordinary by any other navy, until the officers could operate independently with confidence. He believed, as Ushakov had believed, that the quality of training and the initiative of commanders mattered more than any technical advantage. The opportunity to demonstrate this came in November 1853, in the early weeks of what would become the Crimean War. A squadron of Ottoman warships, 7 frigates, 3 corvettes, and 2 steamships was sheltering in the harbour of Sinop on the northern coast of Anatolia when Nakimov's fleet arrived in the roads and blockaded them. The Ottoman commander Osman Pasha was in a desperate position. He could not escape without fighting through the Russian squadron, and his ships were outmatched in both size and firepower. He appealed for help from the Ottoman command at Constantinople, and he waited. Nakimov did not wait. On November 30th, 1853, he led his fleet of 6 ships of the line and 2 frigates into the harbour of Sinop in 2 parallel columns, anchored at close range to the Ottoman ships, and opened fire with devastating effect. His ships were equipped with the newly developed shell guns, a recent innovation that fired explosive shells rather than solid cannonballs, with catastrophic results against wooden hulls. The Ottoman frigates hit by these shells did not just take damage, they caught fire. Their magazines exploded. They were destroyed. Within a few hours, nearly the entire Ottoman squadron had been wiped out. Osman Pasha was wounded and captured. The Battle of Sinop was the last major fleet engagement fought entirely between sailing ships, the final chapter in a tradition of naval warfare that stretched back to the ancient Mediterranean. It was also, ironically, one of the events that triggered the series of decisions that would make sailing warships obsolete within a decade. When news of the battle reached London and Paris, it caused outrage. The destruction of the Ottoman fleet was seen as a deliberate massacre, a naked display of Russian power that could not be allowed to go unanswered. Britain and France entered the war on the Ottoman side, and the first act of their combined navies was to deploy steam-powered warships, vessels that the wind could not stop, that could manoeuvre in any weather, that represented the future of naval warfare in every respect. Nakimov's great victory at Sinop was also, in a larger sense, his last. The war he had begun so brilliantly was about to become something he was not equipped to fight, a modern industrial war against the most powerful navies in Europe. And the place where that war would be decided was Sevastopol. The Crimean War began in earnest in September 1854, when a combined British, French and Ottoman force landed on the Crimean Peninsula and began advancing on Sevastopol. The strategic logic was clear. Sevastopol was the home of the Black Sea Fleet, the naval base from which Russian power projected southward, and if Sevastopol fell, the Russian position in the Black Sea would be untenable. The Allies had superior numbers, superior equipment, and, most critically, a steam-powered navy that could maneuver and operate in ways that the Russian sailing fleet could not match. The Russian admiral commanding at Sevastopol was Pavel Nakimov, elevated to vice-admiral and then admiral during the siege. He faced an impossible situation. His sailing ships, magnificent as they were, could not fight the steam-powered British and French warships that commanded the sea approaches to Sevastopol. The Allied fleet could approach from any direction regardless of the wind, could bombard shore positions without exposing itself to counterfire, could land troops wherever it chose. To send the Russian sailing fleet out to fight would be to sacrifice it uselessly. The decision that was made, and it was one of the most painful in Russian naval history, was to scuttle the fleet. 7 ships of the line and 2 frigates were sunk across the mouth of Sevastopol Bay, their hulls forming an underwater barrier that would prevent Allied warships from entering the harbour. The masts of the sunken ship still protruded above the water, a silent, melancholy forest marking the grave of the Black Sea Fleet. The sailors were landed and organised into infantry units to defend the shore batteries and the trenches that were being dug around the city's landward perimeter. This was the characteristic tragedy of the Crimean War for Russia. Enormous bravery and sacrifice, directed with great effectiveness at an enemy that had better guns, better ships, better logistics, and better medicine. The Russian soldiers and sailors who defended Sevastopol fought with extraordinary tenacity for nearly a year, holding positions against repeated Allied assaults, enduring bombardments that lasted for days and nights at a time, maintaining morale and cohesion in conditions of terrible suffering. Nakimov himself moved constantly among the defenders, visible on the walls and in the batteries, refusing to stay in safe positions, drawing strength from his presence by his sailors and returning it to them multiplied. On June 28, 1855, Nakhimov was on the Malakhov bastion, the key defensive work on the eastern side of Sevastopol, the position that both sides understood to be the hinge of the defence. He was standing at a parapet looking through a telescope at the French positions when a bullet hit him in the head. He lived for 2 days in unconsciousness before dying on June 30th. He was 53 years old. The city fell 2 months later, on September 8th, when French troops finally stormed and held the Malakhov bastion. The Russian commander ordered the evacuation of the city and the destruction of everything that could not be carried away. The remaining ships in the harbour were scuttled, the magazines were blown up, the docks and arsenals were demolished. The soldiers and sailors crossed the bridge of boats to the north side of the bay and watched their city burn. The loss of Sevastopol was, by the terms of the Peace of Paris in 1856, followed by something even more devastating. Russia was forbidden to maintain warships on the Black Sea at all. The sea for which Russia had fought wars since the days of Catherine the Great, the sea where Ushakov had built his legend and Nakhimov had destroyed the Ottoman fleet at Sinop, was now closed to Russian military vessels. Sevastopol itself was to be demilitarized. The Black Sea Fleet, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. It was the lowest point in the history of Russian sea power, since Peter the Great had found that English sailboat in a storage shed. It was also, though no one knew it yet, the beginning of a transformation, because the Crimean War had made absolutely clear to every thinking person in Russia that the age of wooden sailing ships was over, that the industrial age had arrived, and that if Russia was ever going to be a great naval power again, it would have to embrace the new technology with the same energy that Peter the Great had once embraced the Dutch shipbuilders. The Russia that emerged from the Crimean War was a Russia in shock. The defeat had exposed the fundamental backwardness of the Russian military and industrial system in relation to the Western powers, and it had unleashed a wave of reforming energy, the abolition of serfdom in 1861, the reform of the army and navy, the expansion of the railway network, the beginnings of industrial development that would transform the country over the following decades. But reform was painful, contested and uncertain, and the navy was no exception to this pattern. The central question facing the Russian navy in the 1860s was how to rebuild in an age when the technology of warships was changing more rapidly than at any time since the invention of the cannon. The Crimean War had demonstrated the power of steam, and the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, fought on the other side of the world, demonstrated something even more revolutionary: the power of iron and steel armour. The engagement between the Monitor and the Merrimac, or Virginia, in March 1862, in which two ironclad vessels fought each other for hours without either being sunk, was one of the most closely watched naval events in European capitals, and it announced to the world that the age of the wooden warship was definitively over. Russia faced the daunting challenge of building an entirely new navy from scratch, in a country that was simultaneously trying to industrialize, defeat internal revolutionary movements, and manage the complexities of great power diplomacy. The resources were limited, the priorities were many, and the direction was often unclear. What emerged was a period of intense experimentation, some brilliant, some eccentric, some simply bizarre, that produced one of the strangest collections of warships ever assembled by any navy in history. The most famous, or infamous product of this experimental period was the circular battleship, and the story of how it came to be is one that could only have happened in a country combining genuine technical brilliance with the kind of bureaucratic politics that can elevate a bad idea to official policy. The concept originated with Vice Admiral Andrei Popov, who had served with distinction in the Baltic and Black Sea fleets, and who had developed during the 1860s a theory that a circular hull would provide the ideal platform for a large-caliber naval gun, because it would give the weapon a 360-degree arc of fire without requiring it to be mounted on a complex rotating turret. The idea was not entirely without merit in theory, but in practice the circular ships, two were built, the Novgorod in 1873 and the Vice Admiral Popov in 1875, were catastrophically unsuitable for naval operations. They were intended for coastal defence on the shallow waters of the Black Sea, and they were indeed nearly unsinkable. Their circular shape meant they presented no conventional target for enemy torpedoes or shells, but they rolled alarmingly in any kind of sea, They were nearly impossible to steer, they rotated in circles when their guns were fired, and their maximum speed was barely adequate to maintain position against a moderate current. Sailors who served on them reportedly became seasick in harbour. They were a solution to a problem that had been incorrectly defined, built at considerable expense, and they spent most of their service lives tied up at the dock. The circular ships were an embarrassment, but they were also symptomatic of a deeper problem. The Russian Navy in the 1860s and 1870s lacked a coherent strategic vision. It had money for some ships, expertise for others, political patrons with conflicting priorities, and no consistent doctrine about what kind of navy Russia needed or what it was supposed to do. The result was a fleet that combined some genuinely excellent vessels, particularly the ocean-going cruisers that the Navy built for commerce raiding operations, with oddities like the circular ships and various other experimental designs that went nowhere. The fog of a strategic confusion began to lift somewhat after 1871, when the Franco-Prussian War and the collapse of French power created an opportunity for Russia to repudiate the Black Sea clauses of the Treaty of Paris. Russia announced that it no longer considered itself bound by the restrictions on Black Sea naval operations, and the other European powers, preoccupied with the new German Empire, accepted this revision without effective protest. The Black Sea was open again. Sevastopol could be rebuilt. The rebuilding of Sevastopol and the reconstruction of the Black Sea Fleet proceeded through the 1870s and 1880s with a mixture of energy and contradiction. New dry docks were excavated, new arsenals were built, new ships were laid down. The city that had been a ruin in 1856 began to rise again from its ashes, and the harbour that had once held the sailing fleet of Nakhimov and Lazarev began to fill with the new ironclad warships of the steam age. But the fundamental strategic problem remained. The Black Sea was an enclosed sea, and any fleet based at Sevastopol could only reach the Mediterranean by passing through the Bosphorus, a strait controlled by the Ottoman Empire which had every reason to keep Russian warships out. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 gave Russia another opportunity to attack this problem, and the results were mixed. Russian torpedo boats, a new and revolutionary weapon, capable of sinking ironclad warships with a relatively small and inexpensive vessel, achieved several notable successes on the Danube and in the Black Sea, and the war ended with Russia advancing to the gates of Constantinople. But at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the other great powers forced Russia to accept a settlement that denied it control of the straits and left the Ottoman Empire as the guardian of the Bosphorus. The window to the Mediterranean remained closed. The strategic frustrations of the Mediterranean pushed Russian naval ambitions in a new direction in the last decades of the 19th century, eastward toward the Pacific. Russia had been expanding across Siberia for 2.5 centuries, and by the 1890s it had reached the Pacific coast. The acquisition of Vladivostok, whose name means ruler of the East, in 1860 gave Russia a Pacific port, but Vladivostok was frozen for months of the year, and the railway connecting it to European Russia would not be completed until 1904. Russia wanted a better Pacific base. The opportunity seemed to come with the weakness of China, following its humiliating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Russia, in concert with France and Germany, pressured Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China after Japan's victory, and then, in a move of breathtaking geopolitical cynicism, leased that same peninsula from China for 25 years, including the ice-free harbour of Port Arthur, which became the base of Russia's Pacific Fleet. The construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway across Manchuria to Port Arthur further extended Russian power into Northeast Asia. The Japanese, who had their own imperial ambitions in Korea and Manchuria, and who had been forced to give up the Liaodong Peninsula by the very power that now occupied it, watched these developments with cold fury. The Russo-Japanese War that broke out in February 1904, when Japan launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, was the direct consequence of this period of Russian expansion, and the naval dimension of that war would produce the most catastrophic defeat in Russian naval history. The story of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the fleet sent from the Baltic to relieve Port Arthur and reinforce Russian naval power in the Pacific, is one of the greatest epics of futility and human endurance in naval history. It is a story so extraordinary that it reads like the plot of a novel, thousands of men sailing 18,000 miles across 3 oceans, through tropical heat and Arctic storms, through months of mechanical breakdowns and disease and gathering dread, toward a battle they had every reason to fear they could not win. The squadron was commanded by Vice Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a man of considerable professional ability who had the misfortune to be tasked with a mission that was, from the beginning, almost certainly impossible. When the squadron sailed from Libau in October 1904, Port Arthur was already under siege. By the time the fleet arrived in Asian waters, the port had fallen and the Pacific Squadron ships that the second squadron was supposed to reinforce had all been sunk or captured. Rozhestvensky was sailing toward a battle whose strategic rationale had disappeared, with a fleet that was not fully trained, against an enemy that had been at war for a year and whose naval skills were honed to a fine edge. The fleet that left Libau was a motley collection of vessels: 8 battleships, 3 coastal defence ships, 8 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and a train of supply ships and auxiliaries. Some of the warships were modern and powerful. The 4 Borodino-class battleships were among the best in the world when they were commissioned. Others were old, slow, or poorly suited for oceanic operations. The crews were a mixture of experienced regular Navy men and hastily trained conscripts who had, in some cases, never served at sea before they found themselves in the North Sea in October. The voyage began with disaster. Off the Dogger Bank in the North Sea, the panicking fleet opened fire on a fleet of British fishing trawlers, apparently convinced in the darkness and confusion that they were Japanese torpedo boats. An extraordinary thing to believe in the North Sea, 8,000 miles from Japan. Several fishermen were killed and injured, the trawlers were damaged, and the incident nearly brought Britain into the war on Japan's side. Rozhestvensky sailed on through the diplomatic crisis, but the reputation of the squadron was already tarnished. The fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, refused permission to use the Suez Canal under international neutrality rules in the southern summer, suffering terribly from the tropical heat as it crossed the Indian Ocean. The coal-burning battleships had to be coaled at sea from supply ships, a process that was exhausting, dangerous, and that covered every surface of every ship with black dust. The men were tired, dirty, demoralised by the news from home of defeats on land and the fall of Port Arthur, and increasingly aware that they were sailing toward a battle they were unlikely to survive. The Battle of Tsushima was fought on May 27th and 28th, 1905, in the strait between Japan and Korea. The Japanese fleet, commanded by the meticulous and brilliant Admiral Togohei Hachiro, had been waiting for months, its crews rested and trained, its ships carefully maintained. Rozhestvensky had no realistic hope of avoiding battle. He had to get through the strait to reach Vladivostok, and Togo had the advantage of speed, position, and superior gunnery. The battle was decided within the first hour by a single devastating tactical move. Togo, whose fleet was approaching the Russian line from ahead, turned his ships in sequence across the front of the Russian line, a manoeuvre called crossing the T, which allowed his ships to fire all their guns in broadside while the Russian ships could only use their forward guns. The leading Russian battleships were subjected to concentrated fire from the entire Japanese fleet before the rest of the Russian line could come to their support. The flagship Suvorov was hit hundreds of times in the first hour, reduced to a burning wreck. Rozhestvensky himself was wounded and incapacitated. By nightfall of the first day, 4 of the 8 battleships had been sunk. Japanese destroyers attacked through the night with torpedoes. By the following evening, the battle was essentially over. Of the 38 Russian warships that had entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 escaped to neutral ports where they were interned. 3 destroyers and a hospital ship reached Vladivostok. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. It was the most complete naval victory in modern history, a more total destruction than Trafalgar, a greater disproportion of losses than almost any other fleet engagement. The prisoners taken after Tsushima included Rozhestvensky himself, captured after his flagship sank and treated by the Japanese with great courtesy. He was repatriated after the peace and subjected to a court-martial, which acquitted him of responsibility, placing the blame instead on the impossible mission he had been given. He died in 1909, having published his memoirs but never fully recovered from the wounds he received at Tsushima. The sailors who had made the 18,000-mile voyage and survived were scattered across the globe, in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps, in the neutral ports where their ships had taken refuge, in the handful of vessels that reached Vladivostok. They had sailed further and endured more than almost any fleet in history, and the reward had been annihilation. Tsushima was not just a military defeat, it was a political earthquake. The news reached St. Petersburg and sparked enormous shock. A shock that fed directly into the revolutionary ferment that was already bubbling through Russian society. The revolution of 1905 began while the second squadron was still at sea, and when the survivors came home, they came back to a country that was questioning everything, including the competence of the regime that had sent their shipmates to die in the Pacific. The decade between Tsushima and the First World War was, for the Russian Navy, a period of intensive reconstruction and reflection. The navy that had been shattered in the Pacific had to be rebuilt from the ground up, and this time there was genuine intellectual engagement with the lessons of the war. The failure at Tsushima had not been primarily a failure of courage. The Russian sailors had fought under appalling conditions with great determination, but of training, doctrine, maintenance, and strategic planning. The new building programs and the new naval doctrines that emerged in the years after 1905 attempted to address all of these failures. New ships were ordered. The Gangat-class dreadnoughts for the Baltic, modern cruisers and destroyers for both fleets. A new naval staff system was created to provide the kind of professional planning function that the Tsushima campaign had so conspicuously lacked. Foreign expertise was again solicited, as it had been in Peter's day, but this time the emphasis was on incorporating foreign knowledge into Russian institutional frameworks, rather than simply importing foreign officers. The goal was a genuinely Russian navy that could stand on its own. The revolution of 1905 also left its mark on the navy in a specific and memorable way. In June 1905, while the survivors of Tsushima were still making their way home, the crew of the battleship Potemkin, based at the Black Sea Fleet, mutinied. The immediate cause was rotten meat. The ship's doctor had certified maggot-infested beef as fit to eat, and when the officers tried to force the sailors to eat it, the situation exploded. The officers were killed or thrown overboard, the ship was seized, and for 11 days the Potemkin sailed the Black Sea under a red flag, a floating symbol of revolution that the Tsarist government could neither destroy nor ignore. The mutiny was eventually ended when the ship sought refuge in the Romanian port of Constanta, and the crew surrendered to Romanian authorities, but the image of the battleship flying the red flag had entered Russian political mythology, where it would remain for generations. When the First World War began in August 1914, the Russian Navy found itself in a complicated strategic position. The Baltic Fleet was effectively bottled up in the Gulf of Finland by the German High Seas Fleet, which was far superior in modern capital ships. The Black Sea Fleet was at war with the Ottoman Empire, which had been given 2 German warships, the battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, whose German crews attacked Russian ports and shipping in the opening weeks of the war under the Ottoman flag, forcing the Black Sea Fleet onto the defensive. The Baltic campaign that developed over the following years was, by the standards of the great battles of the war, a relatively modest affair, but it was also one of the most intellectually sophisticated mine warfare campaigns in history. The Russian admiral responsible for the Baltic defence, Nikolai Essen, was a gifted strategist who understood that his fleet could not hope to defeat the Germans in open battle, and who therefore organised a campaign of defensive mining combined with offensive submarine operations and destroyer raids that made the eastern Baltic an extremely hazardous environment for German naval operations. The mine-laying was conducted on a massive scale. Russian destroyers and mine-layers worked through the short Baltic nights, laying fields of mines that sank German cruisers and destroyers throughout the war. The German fleet was never able to push through to the Gulf of Finland and threaten St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd at the start of the war to remove its German-sounding name. It was not a glorious campaign. There were no Gangats or Chesmas or Synops, but it achieved its strategic objective of keeping the German fleet away from the Russian capital. The Black Sea told a different and ultimately more satisfying story. Once the initial shock of the German warships had been absorbed, the Black Sea Fleet under Admiral Eberhard and then under Admiral Kolchak, the same Kolchak who would later lead the White Army in the Civil War, conducted an energetic campaign that progressively dominated the sea. Russian submarines sank Ottoman transports carrying supplies to the Turkish armies fighting in the Caucasus. Surface forces shelled Ottoman ports and intercepted supply convoys. By 1916, the Black Sea Fleet had achieved a degree of naval supremacy that Russia had always dreamed of, and the straits seemed within reach. Then the revolution came, and everything changed. The February Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsar and established a provisional government, produced its most dramatic and violent scenes in the naval bases of the Baltic Fleet, particularly at Kronstadt, the island fortress that guarded the sea approaches to Petrograd, and at Helsingfors, the Finnish capital that served as the main base of the Baltic Fleet. The sailors of these bases, many of them young men from peasant and working-class backgrounds, who had been exposed to revolutionary ideas and who harboured deep resentments against the rigid class hierarchy of the Tsarist officer corps, erupted in violence. In the first days of the February Revolution, sailors at Kronstadt and Helsingfors murdered dozens of officers, some of them men who had served with distinction and genuine care for their crews, killed in the fury of a moment that made no distinctions between the good and the bad. Admiral Nepenin, commander of the Baltic Fleet, was shot by his own sailors while trying to bring order to Helsingfors. The murders were a sign of how deep the resentments ran, and they marked the beginning of a period in which the sailors of the Baltic Fleet would be among the most radical and violent actors in Russian politics. The Kronstadt sailors, the Kronstadters, became in 1917 the shock troops of revolution, the most uncompromising advocates of immediate and total transformation. When Lenin arrived at the Finland station in April 1917, after his sealed train journey from Switzerland, it was a Kronstadt sailor who gave the welcoming speech. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, it was the cruiser Aurora, lying in the Neva River near the Winter Palace, that fired the blank shot that signalled the beginning of the assault on the provisional government. The Aurora's gun, that moment, that blank shot in the autumn darkness, it is one of the defining images of the Russian century. The civil war that followed the Bolshevik seizure of power was for the Russian Navy a period of dissolution and improvised reconstitution. The Baltic Fleet lost most of its operational bases when Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania achieved independence, a direct consequence of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that the Bolsheviks signed with Germany in March 1918, surrendering vast territories in exchange for peace. The Black Sea Fleet was partly captured by the Germans, partly scuttled by its own crews to prevent capture, partly taken over by the anti-Bolshevik white forces in the south. The Pacific Fleet, such as it was, faced intervention by Japanese, American, British and other foreign forces in Siberia. What the Bolsheviks salvaged from this chaos was built largely on the basis of the river flotillas, gunboats and improvised warships that operated on the great rivers of Russia, and that provided crucial support for the Red Army in a war fought largely across a vast inland landscape. The Volga Flotilla, the Dnieper Flotilla, the Kama Flotilla. These riverine forces, crewed largely by sailors from the old Tsarist navy who had chosen the red side, played a decisive role in the Civil War, providing fire support, transporting troops, and controlling the river crossings that were the highways of the conflict. In the ice-filled Baltic, a smaller drama unfolded. The great ice cruise of March to April 1918, when Baltic Fleet ships were moved from Helsingfors, threatened by advancing German and Finnish forces, to Kronstadt in conditions of extreme danger, navigating through ice that was still thick enough to threaten the hulls of the ships. The operation was organised by the fleet's new Soviet commander, Alexei Shastny, who managed to save over 200 warships from capture. Shastny was later executed by the Bolsheviks, accused implausibly of plotting counter-revolution, but the ice cruise he organised kept the Baltic Fleet alive to fight another day. The most dramatic episode in the early Soviet Navy's history came not from external enemies but from within, the Kronstadt uprising of March 1921, when the same sailors who had been the shock troops of the Bolshevik Revolution turned against the Bolshevik government. The Kronstadt sailors of 1921 were not, for the most part, the radical workers who had seized power in 1917. The original Kronstadt garrison had been dispersed through the Civil War, and the men who now manned the fortress were largely peasant conscripts who carried into their service the desperate grievances of the countryside, the grain requisitioning, the suppression of village democracy, the terror of the Cheka. The uprising began in late February 1921 and demanded an end to Bolshevik political monopoly, freedom of speech and press for socialist parties, an end to grain requisitioning. Lenin called it a counter-revolutionary rebellion. Trotsky threatened to shoot the rebels like partridges. In March, Red Army troops were sent across the ice of the frozen Gulf of Finland to storm the fortress, dressed in white camouflage against the snow, suffering enormous casualties from the fortress guns. After 10 days of fighting, Kronstadt fell. Those rebels who could not escape across the ice to Finland were shot or sent to labour camps. The Kronstadt uprising shook Lenin deeply. He admitted privately that it represented a genuine expression of popular discontent that the party could not simply dismiss, and it contributed directly to the introduction of the new economic policy, which relaxed the most extreme economic controls of the Civil War period. But for the Navy, the significance of Kronstadt was different. It marked the final break between the radical, free-thinking sailor politics of the revolutionary period and the disciplined, hierarchical, ideologically conformist navy that the Soviet state was now determined to build. The reconstruction of the Soviet Navy through the 1920s and 1930s was a story of enormous ambition constantly constrained by resources. The Soviet Union was a poor country, rebuilding from the devastation of the World War, the Civil War, and the famines that had followed. Every ruble spent on warships was a ruble not spent on the factories and railways that the country desperately needed. Stalin, when he came to power in the late 1920s and consolidated his position through the 1930s, had conflicting naval instincts. He wanted a great ocean-going navy as a symbol of Soviet power and as a genuine strategic asset, but he was also deeply suspicious of the navy as an institution, as a world that was full of foreign contacts and technical expertise that sat uneasily within the paranoid framework of Stalinist politics. The Great Purge of 1937 to 1938 hit the Navy with particular ferocity. Almost the entire senior officer corps was arrested, shot, or sent to labour camps, men who had, in many cases, spent decades building professional competence, who had studied abroad, who had contacts with foreign navies, who had the kind of independent technical expertise that Stalin found threatening. The Navy People's Commissar Pyotr Smirnov was shot. 3 fleet commanders were shot. Hundreds of captains and admirals disappeared into the gulags or the execution chambers. The navy that would fight the Second World War was commanded in many cases by men who had been junior lieutenants or engineers in 1937, men who had been promoted far beyond their experience because everyone above them was dead or in prison. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Navy was in a peculiar position. It was numerically large, hundreds of submarines, scores of surface ships, but it was poorly commanded, badly supplied, and operating under the shadow of the purges that had decapitated its professional leadership. The Baltic Fleet, based at Tallinn and Kronstadt, was in immediate danger from the German advance. The Black Sea Fleet was better positioned but faced the Romanian Navy and the threat of Axis air power. The Northern Fleet, based at Murmansk and Polyani on the Arctic coast, was the smallest of the fleets, but the one that would soon find itself at the centre of one of the war's most critical logistical operations. The early months of the war were catastrophic. The Baltic Fleet lost enormous numbers of ships to German mines and air attack. The evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941, when the fleet attempted to move the garrison and civilian population to Kronstadt in the face of overwhelming German air power, cost the lives of thousands of sailors and soldiers and the loss of dozens of warships. The evacuation has been compared to Dunkirk, but without the survival of the army, hundreds of ships were sunk over 3 days of air attack, and the bodies washed ashore on the Estonian and Finnish coasts for weeks afterward. The city of Leningrad, the former St. Petersburg, the city that Peter the Great had built on the water, the city whose golden admiralty spire had been the symbol of a Russian maritime ambition for 2 centuries, was besieged by German forces from September 1941 until January 1944, in the longest and most deadly siege of the entire war. Nearly 1 million civilians died, most of them from starvation and cold, and throughout those terrible 900 days the guns of the Baltic Fleet played a crucial role in the defence. The warships of the Baltic Fleet unable to move in the mined shallow waters of the eastern Gulf of Finland, but their guns, still serviceable, were used as floating artillery batteries, their powerful naval guns supporting the land defences with fires that could reach positions well behind the German front lines. The battleships Marat and October Revolution, the cruisers Maxim, Gorky and Kirov, dozens of destroyers and smaller vessels, all of them contributed their firepower to the defence of the city that bore the name of the man who had created the navy that bore them. The Marat was bombed and sunk by German aircraft in September 1941. But even as a sunken hulk, she continued to fire her forward turret throughout the siege, a defiant and extraordinary image. The road across the ice of Lake Ladoga, the road of life as Leningraders called it, was protected by Soviet naval, forces on the lake, and the supply convoys that crossed the ice in winter and the water in summer were organised in part by the Lake Ladoga flotilla, whose small ships and gunboats kept the only link to the outside world open through 4 winters of siege. It was unglamorous work, driving trucks across ice that might break at any moment, sailing supply barges through waters under constant air attack, but it was the work that kept Leningrad alive. The Northern Fleet's role in the war was defined by the Allied convoys, the ships from Britain and America that carried supplies to the Soviet Union through the Arctic Ocean to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Arctic convoy route was one of the most dangerous maritime operations of the war. The convoys faced not only German surface ships, submarines and aircraft based in Norway, but also the extreme conditions of the Arctic itself. Ice, fog, storm, temperatures so cold that the spray froze on the rigging and the decks became skating, rinks, where a man who fell overboard would be dead in minutes from hypothermia. The Soviet Northern Fleet's contribution to convoy protection was significant, but often overlooked in Western accounts, which tend to focus on the British and American escorts. Soviet destroyers, submarines and aircraft participated in convoy escort and in offensive operations against German shipping along the Norwegian coast. Soviet submarines sank German tankers and supply ships that were feeding the German forces in northern Norway and Finland, and the port facilities at Murmansk, bombed repeatedly by German aircraft, rebuilt repeatedly by Soviet workers, kept functioning throughout the war, receiving the millions of tons of supplies that flowed in from Britain and America. Among those supplies were 50 American-built PT boats, hundreds of landing craft, and dozens of minesweepers that significantly augmented Soviet naval capability. The Lend-Lease contribution to the Soviet Navy has been somewhat minimized in Soviet and Russian historiography, which has traditionally emphasized the USSR's self-sufficiency, but the reality is that the American-supplied vessels made a genuine difference in a navy that was chronically short of small craft for the coastal operations, convoy escort and amphibious landings that made up much of the naval war. The submarine war in Russian waters was intense and costly on both sides. Soviet submarines operated in the Baltic, the Black Sea and the Arctic, with varying success depending on the theatre and the quality of command. In the Baltic, the submarines faced extraordinary difficulties. The sea was shallow, heavily mined by the Germans and their Finnish allies, and well patrolled. Many Soviet submarines were lost in attempting to break through the mine barriers that the Germans had laid across the Gulf of Finland, and the campaign there was marked by heroism and tragedy in roughly equal measure. The Black Sea was a more favourable, operating environment, and Soviet submarines there achieved significant results against Axis supply convoys running between Romania and the ports of the Crimea and the Caucasian coast. The loss of Sevastopol in July 1942, the second time in a century that the great naval fortress had fallen to an enemy, was a devastating blow, but the Black Sea Fleet maintained its coherence and continued to operate from bases further east, conducting an ongoing campaign against German and Romanian shipping that tied down significant Axis naval resources. In the Arctic, Soviet submarines operated against German supply convoys in the Barents Sea and along the Norwegian coast, sometimes in coordination with British submarines based at Polyarny. The conditions were extreme. The Arctic winter created navigational hazards unlike anything the submarine commanders had trained for. But the operations were persistent and cumulatively effective. The German supply line to Narvik and the Norwegian ports was never cut, but it was made significantly more expensive in ships and men. As the war turned in 1943 and 1944 and the Red Army began its great advance westward, the Navy played an increasingly important role in amphibious operations along the coasts. The liberation of the Crimea in 1944 was preceded by naval landings on the Kerch Peninsula. The advance along the Baltic coast was supported by naval gunfire and by small craft that could move troops across the shallow coastal waters faster than they could march overland. The liberation of Sevastopol itself, in May 1944, the city reconquered 9 years almost to the day after its fall to the Germans, was an emotional moment for the entire Navy, a restoration of the place that embodied more than any other the tradition and the sacrifice of Russian sea power. The war ended, for the Soviet Navy, with a mixed record that nevertheless represented a fundamental survival and recovery from the disasters of 1941. The Baltic Fleet had suffered enormous losses but remained a functioning force. The Black Sea Fleet had lost Sevastopol and reconquered it. The Northern Fleet had grown from the smallest to one of the most capable of the Soviet fleets, its officers and sailors tempered by years of Arctic operations. And now, in the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union was one of the two greatest military powers on Earth, and the Navy that had survived everything — Tsarist humiliation, revolution, purge, siege, and war — was about to enter the most consequential chapter in its history. The Soviet Navy that emerged from the Second World War was a fundamentally coastal and defensive force, oriented around the protection of Soviet shores rather than the projection of power onto distant oceans. This was consistent with the traditional character of Russian sea power, always more concerned with denying the enemy access to Russian waters than with dominating foreign seas. But in the new strategic environment of the post-war world, it was also a limitation. The United States had built, in the course of the war, the most powerful and far-reaching navy in history, and it was using that navy to project American power into every ocean on Earth. Stalin wanted a navy that could challenge this American dominance, and in the late 1940s he authorized an enormous naval construction program — battleships, cruisers, destroyers — on a scale that recalled Peter the Great's ambitions, if not his practical methods. But Stalin died in 1953 before this program could be completed, and his successor Nikita Khrushchev was deeply skeptical of surface warships, which he considered expensive relics in an age of missiles and nuclear weapons. He cancelled the battleship program, scrapped dozens of ships that were already under construction, and redirected Soviet naval investment toward the weapon system that would define the Cold War naval competition — the submarine. The nuclear submarine changed naval warfare more fundamentally than any development since the introduction of steam power, and the Soviet Union pursued it with intense urgency from the moment the United States launched the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, in 1954. A nuclear submarine could stay submerged indefinitely, could travel at speeds that conventional submarines could not match even on the surface, and, when armed with ballistic missiles, could threaten the cities of any nation on Earth from any point in the world's oceans, nearly impossible to find and nearly impossible to destroy. The Soviet submarine program of the 1950s and 1960s was the largest in history. Hundreds of submarines built in a frantic rush that sometimes sacrificed quality for quantity. The early Soviet nuclear submarines were plagued by reactor problems, construction defects, and the consequences of building cutting-edge technology under extreme political pressure in a system that punished the reporting of bad news. Radiation accidents were common and not always reported accurately. Sailors suffered from radiation exposure that was not always acknowledged. But the program continued because the alternative, allowing the United States to maintain unchallenged nuclear supremacy at sea, was strategically unacceptable. The submarine that became the symbol of this dangerous, brilliant, terrifying program was the K-19. Commissioned in 1960 and the Soviet Union's first nuclear ballistic missile submarine, the K-19 experienced a catastrophic reactor accident on July 4, 1961, when the cooling system failed and the reactor began to overheat, in a way that threatened a meltdown and possibly a nuclear explosion. The captain, Nikolai Zateyev, made the decision to send his crew into the reactor compartment to improvise a cooling system, knowing that the men he was sending would be exposed to lethal doses of radiation. The volunteers improvised a fix, working in shifts in the burning reactor space, wearing ineffective protective gear that provided almost no protection against the radiation they were absorbing. They stopped the meltdown. The ship survived. But 8 of the men who worked in the reactor room died within weeks from acute radiation sickness, and dozens more suffered long-term health consequences. Captain Zatayev, who had made the decision that saved the ship and possibly prevented a nuclear catastrophe in the North Atlantic, was given a reprimand for allowing the accident to happen. The K-19 was repaired and returned to service, where it suffered further accidents that killed more crew members. The survivors called her Hiroshima. The operational reality of the Cold War naval competition was played out in the depths of every ocean on Earth, in a game of mutual surveillance and counter-surveillance that was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. American attack submarines tracked Soviet ballistic missile submarines, trying to maintain contact so that they could destroy them in the first minutes of a nuclear war before the Soviet missiles could be launched. Soviet attack submarines shadowed American carrier battle groups, maintaining firing solutions so that they could sink the carriers in those same first minutes. Both sides sent submarines to examine the other side's naval exercises, to listen to radio communications, to catalogue the acoustic signatures of opposing vessels. The encounters were sometimes alarmingly close. Soviet and American submarines occasionally collided, bumping against each other in the dark water, and there were moments when the tension of the Cold War came very close to breaking through the surface in ways that could not be controlled. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 included a naval dimension that was almost as dangerous as the more famous confrontation over the missiles themselves. 4 Soviet submarines were caught on the surface by American forces blockading Cuba, forced to the surface by depth, charges, and ordered to turn back. On one of those submarines, the B-59, the captain and political officer agreed to launch a nuclear torpedo, believing that war had already begun, before the executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his required concurrence, preventing the launch. Arkhipov's refusal may well have prevented a nuclear war. The architect of the Soviet Navy's transformation from a coastal defense force into a true ocean-going power was Sergei Gorshkov, who served as Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy from 1956 to 1985. Nearly 3 decades during which he rebuilt the fleet from its Khrushchev-era doldrums into a force capable of challenging the United States in every ocean. Gorshkov was a brilliant strategic thinker who understood naval power in systemic terms, not just ships and submarines, but support vessels, forward bases, maintenance infrastructure, the entire ecology of sustained ocean operations. Under Gorshkov, Soviet submarines and ships began operating regularly in the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean and Mediterranean. The Soviet Navy established naval facilities in Egypt, Somalia, Vietnam, Cuba and elsewhere. Not permanent bases in the American sense, but access agreements that allowed Soviet warships to refuel, resupply and conduct repairs far from their home ports. Soviet naval aviation developed long-range maritime patrol aircraft that could survey vast areas of ocean. Soviet intelligence collection ships, disguised as fishing vessels or research ships, monitored NATO exercises, cable traffic, and naval facilities around the world. The surface ships of the Gorshkov era were designed around a distinctive Soviet naval philosophy. Rather than building American-style carrier battle groups, which were enormously expensive and which the Soviet Union lacked the overseas basing infrastructure to support, the Soviets built specialized missile cruisers and destroyers capable of overwhelming a carrier battle group with massive salvos of long-range anti-ship missiles. The Kirov-class battle cruisers, the largest surface combatants built since the Second World War, the Slava-class missile cruisers, the Oscar-class submarines designed to sink American carriers, all of them embodied the idea that quantity and firepower could substitute for the global infrastructure that the United States had spent decades building. The submarine fleet that Gorshkov built was the largest and most complex in history. The Yankee-class ballistic missile submarines of the late 1960s gave the Soviet Navy a genuine second-strike nuclear capability, submarines that could threaten American cities from positions in the North Atlantic, making the American first-strike option far less attractive. The Delta-class submarines that followed in the 1970s carried missiles with even greater range, allowing them to operate from the comparative safety of Soviet coastal waters, under the Arctic ice, in the Barents Sea in the Sea of Okhotsk, while still covering their targets on the American continent. The Typhoon class, introduced in the early 1980s, was the largest submarine ever built. 6 vessels of extraordinary dimensions, each more than 170 metres long, displacing more than 48,000 tons when submerged, carrying 20 ballistic missiles, each armed with 10 independently targetable nuclear warheads. The Typhoons were designed to operate under Arctic ice, using their massive bulk to break through from below when it was time to launch. They were underwater fortresses, equipped with a swimming pool, a sauna, and creature comforts that were a deliberate acknowledgement of the long deployments their crews would undertake. American sailors who later saw them described them as unlike anything in their experience, more like mobile undersea cities than submarines in any conventional sense. Against these submarines, American attack submarines maintained a relentless watch, shadowing their movements, cataloguing their acoustic signatures, developing the knowledge needed to find and destroy them if war came. The contest between Soviet ballistic missile submarines and American attack submarines was the defining naval competition of the Cold War, conducted entirely out of public view, generating no dramatic battles or famous admirals, producing only the slowly accumulated record of near misses, collisions, accidents, and close encounters that the participants carried home in their memory and their bodies. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, and for the Russian Navy the collapse was catastrophic. The fleet that Gorshkov had built over 3 decades, one of the most powerful naval forces in history, was suddenly deprived of the political, economic, and institutional framework that had sustained it. The defence budget collapsed. Ships sat in harbour without fuel. Submarines were tied to their piers, unable to sail for lack of spare parts. Officers and sailors were not paid for months at a time. The maintenance infrastructure that kept nuclear reactors operating safely, the support ships, the specialised facilities, the trained technical personnel, began to deteriorate at an alarming rate. The disposal of the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet became one of the most serious environmental challenges of the decade. Dozens of submarines were decommissioned faster than they could be safely dismantled, their reactors still containing nuclear fuel, their hulls corroding in the remote fjords of the Kola Peninsula and the Pacific coast of Kamchatka. International assistance from Norway, the United States, Japan, helped eventually to address the worst of these problems, but the process was slow and the risks were real. The graveyard of the old Soviet fleet was a monument to the speed with which power can collapse when the system that supports it fails. The Black Sea Fleet underwent a different kind of dissolution. When Ukraine became independent, it inherited the base at Sevastopol and a large portion of the fleet itself. The negotiations between Russia and Ukraine over the division of the Black Sea Fleet were long, complex, and sometimes acrimonious, eventually producing an agreement under which Russia leased Sevastopol for 20 years, a lease that was later extended under political pressure. The symbolism was painful. Sevastopol, the city that had been defended to the last brick in 2 great sieges, the city whose name was synonymous with Russian naval sacrifice, was now subject to a lease negotiated with a foreign state. The defining tragedy of the post-Soviet Navy came in August 2000 in the Barents Sea, where the nuclear submarine Kursk, an Oscar II-class cruise missile submarine, one of the most powerful attack submarines in the world, sank with all hands during a naval exercise. The Kursk was on a routine firing exercise, preparing to launch a practice torpedo, when the torpedo exploded inside the tube. A series of secondary explosions followed in rapid succession, the last large enough to register as a small earthquake on seismometers across the region. The submarine sank to the bottom of the Barents Sea in 350 feet of water, and 118 men were sealed inside. 23 of those men survived the initial explosions, retreating to the stern compartment and sealing themselves in. They wrote notes on paper, scratched messages into the bulkheads, waited for rescue in the cold and the dark. The Russian Navy's initial response was chaotic and inadequate. Rescue craft were dispatched but could not open the submarine's hatches, hampered by damaged equipment, bad weather, and the institutional dysfunction of a navy that had been in decay for a decade. For days, the government insisted that rescue efforts were proceeding well, while the men in the stern compartment were running out of air. Norway and Britain offered deep sea rescue equipment and operators. The Russian government hesitated, apparently reluctant to admit that it could not manage the rescue on its own, apparently worried about foreign eyes seeing the condition of its submarines and the inadequacy of its rescue systems. By the time Norwegian divers opened the hatch on the 5th day, all 23 men in the stern compartment were dead. The last survivors had died, the evidence suggested, within hours of the submarine sinking, meaning that had rescue equipment been allowed in immediately, some, or all of them, might have been saved. The Kursk disaster was, for Vladimir Putin, who had come to power just months earlier, what Tsushima had been for Nicholas II, a moment of devastating revelation about the gap between the Russia he governed and the great power he intended it to be. The navy that had once made the entire world take notice was struggling to rescue its own men in its own home waters. The families of the dead, in televised meetings with the president and senior naval officers, asked questions that had no comfortable answers. Why had help been refused? Why had the navy lied about what it knew? Why had their sons been sent to sea in a submarine that was not properly maintained? Putin acknowledged the failures, replaced the naval leadership, and committed to a program of reconstruction and reform. It would take a decade and more to show results, and the Kursk would remain, in Russian memory, as the name that marked the bottom of the curve, the moment from which the only direction was up. The reconstruction of Russian naval power in the 21st century has been one of the defining projects of the Putin era, and it reflects the same obsession with sea power that has driven Russian rulers since even the terrible looked west toward the Baltic. The budgets have grown. The old Soviet ships that survived the 1990s have been refitted and modernized. New classes of submarines have been laid down. The Voronezh-class ballistic missile submarines, the quietest ever built by Russia, and the Yasen-class attack submarines, comparable in capability to the best American designs. The Severodvinsk, lead boat of the Yasen class, took 25 years to build, a reflection of the disruptions of the 1990s and the gradual recovery of the shipbuilding industry. But when she finally commissioned in 2013, she was a genuine state-of-the-art vessel, equipped with a wide range of weapons including cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,000 miles away. The Voronezh-class submarines, which carry the Bulava ballistic missile, have become the backbone of Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent, replacing the aging Soviet-era Delta-class submarines that had patrolled the Arctic for 3 decades. The surface fleet has been slower to recover. Russia lacks the industrial capacity to build large surface warships quickly, and several ambitious projects, including a class of large frigates and a proposed new aircraft carrier, have been delayed or cancelled by technical and financial difficulties. The aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, Russia's only carrier and one of the last major Soviet-era warships still in service, has had a troubled operational history, marked by accidents, breakdowns, and the embarrassment of deploying to the Syrian coast accompanied by a tugboat in case the carrier's engines failed. But the Russian surface fleet has been gradually renewed at the smaller end of the scale with new corvettes and frigates armed, with the Caliber cruise missile providing a capability that proved, in the Syrian campaign of 2015 and after, to be an effective and globally visible demonstration of Russian reach. The annexation of Crimea in March 2014 was, from a naval strategic perspective, the resolution of a problem that had haunted Russian planners since 1991, the uncertainty about Sevastopol, the city where the Black Sea Fleet was based, the city that had been leased from Ukraine under agreements that could be terminated. Russia's incorporation of Crimea, regardless of its legal and political dimensions, eliminated that uncertainty. Sevastopol was Russian again, permanently, and the Black Sea Fleet was secure in its home. The strategic implications rippled outward from that decision in ways that are still unfolding. Russia's access to the Black Sea and through the straits to the Mediterranean became more secure. The naval facilities at Sevastopol, which had been maintained at a basic level under the lease arrangement, were expanded and upgraded. New ships were assigned to the Black Sea Fleet, including Kilo-class submarines capable of launching Caliber cruise missiles, which proved their capability in strikes on targets in Syria, launched from the eastern Mediterranean. The Syrian campaign that began in 2015 was the first significant combat deployment of Russian naval forces since the Soviet era, and it demonstrated several things simultaneously: the genuine operational capability of the modernized Russian Navy, the particular effectiveness of submarine-launched cruise missiles as a long-range precision strike weapon, and the political will to use naval power as an instrument of foreign policy in a way that recalled the ambitions of Catherine the Great and her Mediterranean expedition of 1769. The Caspian flotilla, which had no access to the sea beyond the Caspian itself, launched cruise missile strikes on targets in Syria from a range of over 1,000 miles. An extraordinary demonstration of precision strike capability from what had previously been considered a purely lake-bound force. In the 21st century, the Arctic has become the new frontier of Russian naval ambition, and in this the Russians have a head start over everyone else. The Soviet Union maintained a constant presence in the Arctic throughout the Cold War, developing the nuclear icebreaker fleet that gave the Soviet Union, and now Russia, the only year-round reliable surface navigation capability in the Arctic Ocean. The Northern Sea Route, the passage along the Russian Arctic coast from Murmansk to the Pacific, has been a focus of Soviet and Russian investment for a century, and as climate change has begun to reduce Arctic sea ice, it is becoming increasingly practical as a commercial shipping route that could significantly reduce transit times between Europe and Asia. Russia has responded to this opportunity by reopening Soviet-era Arctic bases, building new icebreakers that are the largest and most capable in the world, and maintaining a submarine presence under the Arctic ice that is continuous and substantial. The Arctic is, in Russian strategic thinking, not just a transportation corridor but a defensive glacis, a zone of deep water and ice that protects the heartland of Russia from sea-based approaches, that conceals the ballistic missile submarines whose survival in a nuclear exchange is the ultimate guarantee of Russia's security. The Northern Fleet, which during the Cold War had been the most powerful of the Soviet fleets, was elevated in 2021 to the status of a military district, the same administrative status as a land-based military district, acknowledging the Arctic's centrality to Russian strategic planning. The Arktika icebreaker, commissioned in 2020, is the most powerful icebreaker ever built, nuclear-powered, capable of breaking through ice nearly 3 meters thick, able to operate independently for years without refueling. It is, in its way, as much a monument to Russian maritime ambition as Peter's shipyards at Voronezh or Catherine's fleet in the Mediterranean. The submarine force remains the core of Russian naval power in the 21st century, as it has been since the Cold War. Russia operates the world's second-largest fleet of nuclear submarines, both ballistic missile submarines for strategic deterrence and attack submarines for conventional and nuclear strike operations. The quality of these boats has improved dramatically since the worst days of the 1990s, when maintenance failures and accidents were a constant threat. The crews are better trained, the maintenance is more regular, and the operational tempo has increased steadily as the defense budget has grown. Russian submarines conduct regular patrols into the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Patrols that are tracked and monitored by NATO forces, but that also serve notice that Russia intends to maintain the kind of global submarine presence that was the hallmark of the Soviet Navy at its height. The cat-and-mouse game that has been played under the world's oceans since the 1950s continues, with modern American and NATO submarines tracking Russian boats and Russian submarines tracking American carriers and Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. In the deep waters of the Arctic, Norwegian fjords, and the North Atlantic, this game is played with extraordinary technical sophistication on both sides. Hydrophones, towed arrays, acoustic signatures, the whole elaborate architecture of underwater intelligence that has been built up over 7 decades of Cold War and its aftermath. The public sees none of it. The newspapers report almost nothing, but it continues every day and every night in the dark water, as it has continued since the first nuclear submarines slipped beneath the surface in the 1950s and began their long vigil in the deep. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the dugout canoes of medieval Ross on the brown rivers of the forest plain to the nuclear submarines cruising silently beneath the Arctic ice, from the firelit harbour of Sinop to the frozen darkness of the Barents Sea, from Peter the Great's little English sailboat to the Typhoon-class submarines that carried enough nuclear weapons to end civilization. It is one of the longest and most continuous stories in the history of naval power, this Russian relationship with the sea. And it is, at its core, a story about the relationship between geography and ambition, between the accident of where you were born and the determination to be something more. Russia has always been, in a fundamental sense, a land power, a continental empire whose vast interior defined its character, whose armies have always been more central to its national identity than its fleets. And yet, from the very beginning, the sea has called. The rivers led to it. The trade demanded it. The great powers of the world commanded it. And Russia would not be commanded. And so Tsar after Tsar, admiral after admiral, commissar after commissar, they sent their ships out onto the water, knowing the dangers, knowing the costs, building and rebuilding the fleet that would give Russia a voice on the oceans of the world. The story of the Russian Navy is also, inescapably, a story about the ordinary men who served in it, the conscripted peasants who had never seen the sea before. Peter's recruiting parties dragged them from their villages, the sailors who fought with extraordinary courage at Chesma and Sinop and Tsushima and Leningrad, the submariners who went down into the dark water in boats that sometimes did not come back up, the men of the Kursk who survived the explosion only to die waiting for help that came too late. Their names are not in the history books mostly, but their bones are in the water, and the fleet that still sails today was built on what they gave. The port of Sevastopol is lit tonight, as it has been lit on thousands of nights since Catherine the Great's engineers first surveyed its harbour and recognised it as a place where a great fleet could shelter. The waters of the Black Sea are dark and still in the small hours, and somewhere beneath the surface of the Arctic Ocean a submarine is moving, quietly, slowly, its nuclear heart beating steadily, on a patrol whose purpose has not changed in 70 years, even as the world above has transformed itself beyond recognition. It carries the accumulated weight of all the centuries we have travelled through tonight, the memory of Gangut and Chesma and Sinop and Tsushima, the tradition of Ushakov and Nakhimov and Gorshkov, the sacrifice of 10,000 sailors whose names no one remembers anymore. The sea remembers. The sea always remembers. It holds everything that has ever been committed to it. The ships, the men, the ambitions, the disasters, the moments of transcendent courage, and the moments of tragic failure. They are all down, there, in the water that does not sleep, on the ocean floor where the light never reaches, where the cold is absolute and the silence is complete. No complete history of a navy can be told entirely through battles and admirals and political decisions. There is another layer to the story, the layer of legend and mystery, of ships that disappeared without explanation, of treasures still resting on the ocean floor, of encounters that no official record was ever written about, but that sailors remembered and passed down from generation to generation. The Russian Navy has its own rich tradition of these stories, and they deserve their place in the telling. The most famous sunken treasure in Russian naval history may be the gold of the Admiral Nakhimov, not the admiral himself, but a passenger steamship that bore his name, which sank in 1905 near the island of Tsushima, in the very waters where the great naval battle had just been fought. The Nakhimov went down carrying, according to persistent rumour and some documentary evidence, a large quantity of gold and silver coin intended to pay the wages of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, money that has never been recovered, that lies somewhere in the depths of the Tsushima Strait, and that has attracted treasure hunters from Russia, Japan and elsewhere for over a century. Japanese salvagers attempted recovery operations in the 1980s, raising enormous excitement and some preliminary finds. But the main treasure, if it exists in the form claimed, was never located. The Soviet government maintained that the wreck held no significant treasure. The Japanese entrepreneurs who financed the expeditions believed otherwise. The ship lies in water deep enough to make recovery genuinely difficult, and the question of what it contains remains, appropriately, unresolved. Some mysteries do not want to be solved. Among the ships that went down at Tsushima, the battleship Imperator Alexander III, named for the father of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, has a particular place in naval mythology. She was one of the 4 Borodino-class battleships, modern and powerful, and she fought throughout the day of battle before being overwhelmed in the evening, capsizing with all hands. Not a single member of her crew of 867 men survived. When Japanese destroyers swept the area after the battle, they found only floating debris and the bodies of men who had clearly fought until the moment the ship went under. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps embellished in the telling and retelling of more than a century, that the night before the fleet entered the strait, several sailors on different ships independently reported seeing, in the water alongside their vessels, the forms of drowned men drifting in the current. Some claimed they recognized faces. Officers dismissed the reports as the product of exhaustion and fear, but the sailors who told them were not generally given to superstition, and they told the story consistently enough that it found its way into the memoirs of survivors. Whether vision or apparition, or simply the mind's translation of overwhelming dread into imagery, the story belongs to the tradition of naval ghost lore that spans every culture that has ever sent men to sea. The Cold War produced its own mysteries, several of which remain officially unresolved. The most tantalizing is the disappearance of the Soviet submarine K-129 in March 1968. The submarine, a Gulf II-class ballistic missile boat carrying 3 nuclear missiles, vanished in the Pacific Ocean northwest of Hawaii without sending a distress signal. The Soviet Navy searched for it without success. The American Navy, whose hydrophone networks had detected the sound of the submarine's destruction, quietly located the wreck on the ocean floor about 3 miles below the surface. What followed was one of the most audacious intelligence operations in Cold War history. The CIA, working through the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes as a front, commissioned the construction of a special salvage ship, the Glomar Explorer, ostensibly for deep-sea mining operations, which was in reality a ship built specifically to raise the K-129 from the ocean floor. The operation, codenamed Project Azorian, was conducted over the summer of 1974 under conditions of extreme secrecy, with the Soviet Navy unaware that the wreck of their submarine was being excavated 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific. What the operation recovered has never been fully disclosed. Official accounts say that the raising attempt was partially successful. A portion of the submarine's hull was raised, including human remains and some equipment, but that the most valuable sections, including the nuclear missiles and the communication codes, were lost when the hull broke apart during recovery. Some of those involved in the project have suggested that more was recovered than was officially acknowledged. The Soviet sailors whose remains were found were given a burial at sea by the American sailors of the Glomar Explorer, in a ceremony that was filmed and later, years after the Cold War ended, provided to the Russian government as an act of posthumous respect. It is one of the stranger and more quietly human stories to emerge from the otherwise entirely inhuman logic of nuclear deterrence. There is a category of Cold War naval mystery that sits at the intersection of the technical and the transcendent, and the most remarkable example involves the Soviet submarine B-59, whose executive officer Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The story has been told in the context of political history, but it has another dimension that is rarely explored: the psychological reality of being sealed in a steel tube beneath the Caribbean Sea in October 1962, depth-charged by American destroyers, cut off from communication with Moscow, genuinely unsure where the nuclear war had begun. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had been in command of a submarine that had been underwater for weeks, in temperatures so extreme. The air conditioning had failed, and the tropical Caribbean water conducted heat into the hull, that temperatures inside reached 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. The crew was suffering from heat exhaustion, carbon dioxide build-up, and the cumulative stress of a mission that had gone far beyond its planned parameters. When the depth charges began falling, many of them believed they were under attack in a war that had already begun. The decision Arkhipov prevented was not the decision of a reckless man, but of a man pushed to the edge of his physical and psychological limits by conditions that no one had been designed to endure. Savitsky survived the crisis and lived until 1999. He gave interviews in his old age in which he reflected on what had happened in the submarine in those hours. He said that in the moments when he believed war had begun, and he was preparing to authorize the torpedo, he had felt completely calm. Not the calm of resignation, but the calm of absolute certainty, of a man who has reduced an impossibly complex situation to a single clear decision. He described it, somewhat uncomfortably for the interviewer, as a religious experience. Arkhippov's refusal had brought him back into the realm of uncertainty, of possibility, of ordinary human time. He was grateful, he said. But the calm of that moment, the terrible clarity of it never entirely left him. The Cold War submarine service produced men who had experienced things that defied ordinary description, and the culture they created was one of deep camaraderie, dark humour, and a shared awareness of mortality that the surface world could not quite access. The submariners who patrolled beneath the Arctic ice for months at a time, who lived in an environment so artificial and so removed from normal human reference points that they lost track of time and season, and the rhythm of day and night, often reported a particular kind of altered consciousness when they returned to the surface, a difficulty in readjusting to a world that seemed, by comparison, shallow and noisy and unnecessarily complicated. There is a story told among Russian submarine veterans, not in official histories, but in the private gatherings of old men who once dove deep, about a Pacific Fleet captain who, after a particularly long deployment under the ice, requested and received permission to delay his return to port by 2 days. When asked why, he said that he needed the time to remember how to be a person again. The request was granted. The Navy understood. Many of its best officers had made the same transition, and they knew that the return from depth was its own kind of navigation, requiring care and patience, and the willingness to surface slowly, the way a diver must to avoid the bends of the soul. Throughout this entire story, through the centuries of battles and empires and strategic competitions, there have been the ordinary men, not the admirals, not the czars, not the commissars and naval architects and diplomatic strategists, but the men who actually pulled the oars and raised the sails and shoveled the coal and operated the nuclear reactors. Their individual stories are largely lost to history, swallowed by the ocean that took so many of them, absorbed into the collective anonymity of the naval service. But something of their world can be reconstructed, and it deserves to be, because without them there would be no Russian navy and no story to tell. Peter the Great's sailors were mostly serfs, conscripted from the villages of inland Russia, men who had never in their lives seen anything larger than a river. The law required a certain number of men from each province, and they were collected and marched to the ports, to Voronezh on the Don, to St. Petersburg on the Neva, to Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, and handed over to naval recruiters who had no interest in their feelings about the sea. The mortality in Peter's navy was appalling, not from battle mostly, but from scurvy and typhus and dysentery, and the basic brutalities of the food and conditions. A man who survived his first year of naval service had demonstrated a toughness that was genuinely remarkable, and the veterans of Peter's wars were, in their own way, as extraordinary as the admirals who commanded them. The discipline was severe by any standard. Flogging was routine, and more severe punishments, including running the gauntlet and death, were not uncommon. But there is evidence that Peter himself was aware that the relationship between commanders and men could not be entirely coercive, that sailors who were treated with total contempt would fight with less ferocity than sailors who felt some connection to their service and their shipmates, the tradition that Ushakov and Nakimov exemplified, the admiral who knew his men by name, who shared their food, who walked among them in battle, was not invented by those officers, but was built on a foundation of understanding that went back to the earliest years of the fleet. The life of a Russian sailor in the age of sail was one of extraordinary physical hardship, combined with a social intimacy that few other occupations could match. A ship's company lived together in a space barely larger than a small apartment building, separated by status but physically inseparable, sharing the experience of weather and war and the particular miseries of naval food. Hard biscuit, salt fish, brackish water, the occasional issue of vodka that was both a comfort and a source of disciplinary problems. The smell of a wooden warship with its hundreds of men in close proximity, its bilge water and tar and hemp, and the residue of the cook's fires, was one that anyone who had experienced it carried in their memory forever. And yet there was something that these men found in the life, something that kept them, or at least the ones who survived, from entirely hating what they did. There was the companionship, first of all, the tight bonds formed in the shared extremity of storms and battles, bonds that civilians found difficult to understand, and that veterans found difficult to replicate once they returned to land. There was the professional pride of competence, a well-drilled gun crew, a topman who could go aloft in a gale, a navigator who could bring the ship through an uncharted strait. These men knew what they could do, and they knew that relatively few people could do it. And there was, perhaps above all, the sea itself, the thing that was simultaneously their workplace and their enemy, and, for some of them, something that approached the sacred. The Russian tradition of naval prayer is an old one, connected to the Orthodox Christian faith that was the official religion of the state and the personal faith of most of its sailors. Every ship's company included a priest, and services were held before battle and after, in thanksgiving or mourning, in the small hours before a difficult passage, or at the moment of arriving in port after a long voyage. The icon corner of a warship, the part of the captain's cabin or the mess deck where the icons were hung, before which candles burned through the night watches, was as much a part of the ship's equipment as its guns and rigging, and the faith it represented was not merely formal but, for many sailors, genuinely sustaining in moments of extreme danger. The history of the Russian Navy includes a persistent undercurrent of discontent and resistance from below, a tradition that is entirely understandable given the conditions of service and the class structure of the Tsarist Navy, but that produced some of the most dramatic episodes in naval history. The Potemkin Mutiny of 1905, which we have already touched on, was the most famous of these episodes, but it was not the first or the last. There had been smaller mutinies and acts of collective resistance throughout the history of the Navy, incidents usually suppressed quickly and quietly, rarely making it into official records except as notations in court-martial proceedings. The grievances were consistent across the centuries: inadequate food, brutal punishment, the contemptuous treatment of lower-deck men by officers who had been raised to regard common people as barely human, and the particular bitterness of men who were risking their lives for a state that showed no evident concern for their welfare. The Revolution of 1917 was, from one perspective, the ultimate mutiny, the final total rejection of the old social order by men who had endured it for too long. The violence at Kronstadt and Helsingfors in February 1917, the murders of officers that shocked educated Russia, can only be understood against the background of this long history of grievance and suppression. It was not random violence, it was the release of a pressure that had been building for decades, and the men who committed it were not, for the most part, simply bloodthirsty criminals, but human beings who had been treated as less than human for their entire lives and who had at last the power to answer back. The Soviet Navy attempted, with considerable success, to build a different relationship between officers and men, one based on shared political ideology rather than social class, on the theoretical equality of socialist citizenship rather than the sharp distinctions of the Tsarist service. In practice, the Soviet Navy was hierarchical in its own way, and the authority of officers was reinforced by the party structure and the security services in ways that were, in some respects, more pervasive than anything in the Tsarist system. But there was a genuine effort, particularly in the early decades, to create a naval culture in which lower-deck men felt themselves to be participants rather than instruments, and this effort left traces that lasted throughout the Soviet period. The history of women in the Russian Navy is largely a hidden history, present at the margins, occasionally breaking through into visibility, mostly submerged in the records of an institution that was officially and effectively male for almost all of its existence. But women were present from the beginning, in the roles that navies have always needed alongside their fighting ships, in the shipyards and arsenals, in the hospitals and supply depots, in the families that waited in the port towns while the men were at sea. During the Second World War, women served in significant numbers in Soviet naval auxiliary roles, as signallers, as nurses and doctors, as navigators on supply vessels in the rivers and coastal waters, as the crews of small craft in the harbours and estuaries where larger ships could not operate. The naval nurse who operated under fire in the ruins of Sevastopol in 1942, carrying wounded sailors through streets under bombardment, was as much a part of the naval war as the submarine commander in the Arctic. Her story was less often told, but it was not less real. The Soviet Union produced the first woman ever to command a submarine, a training submarine, in the late Cold War period. And in the post-Soviet Russian Navy, women have served in increasing numbers in positions that would have been unimaginable in any earlier era. The transformation is gradual and incomplete, contested in places, proceeding at a pace that reflects both genuine progress and persistent institutional resistance. But it is happening, and it is another chapter in a story that has always been more various and more human than the official accounts tended to suggest. There is something about the physical presence of old warships that concentrates history in an unusually intense way. A cannon that was fired at Chesma, a compass that guided a ship, through the Arctic, an anchor from a vessel that participated in the liberation of Sevastopol. These objects carry a weight of meaning that no document can quite replicate. They are the material remains of moments that have receded into the past, and they remind us that history is not merely a story told in words, but an accumulation of physical events that really happened, that involved real people with real bodies, in real ships, on real water. Russia has been comparatively poor in its preservation of naval heritage, partly because of the disruptions of revolution and war, partly because of the Soviet tendency to value the political lessons of history over the preservation of its artifacts. But some things have survived. The ship's boat that Peter the Great called the grandfather of the Russian Navy, restored and maintained, is in the Central Naval Museum in St. Petersburg. The cruiser Aurora, which fired the signal shot of the Bolshevik Revolution, is preserved as a museum ship in the Neva River, visited by thousands of schoolchildren every year, its hull still painted the dark grey of the old Imperial Navy. The submarine D-2 Narodovolets, which served in the Baltic Fleet during the Second World War, is preserved at the Naval Museum in St. Petersburg, allowing visitors to walk through the cramped spaces where her crew lived and fought. In Sevastopol, the panorama of the defence of Sevastopol, a vast circular painting depicting the siege of 1854 to 1855, created at the turn of the 20th century, was destroyed in the Second World War and painstakingly restored afterward. It remains one of the most visited memorials in Crimea, a monument not only to the specific events it depicts, but to the tradition of sacrifice that Sevastopol represents in Russian memory. The harbour itself, with its monuments and its echoes, is a place where the different layers of Russian naval history overlap in ways that are difficult to separate. The sunken ships of the Crimean War, the sunken ships of the Second World War, the living fleet that still operates there today. The Russian language carries within it the marks of the Navy's history. Words and phrases absorbed from Dutch and English and German in the time of Peter the Great, preserved in the maritime vocabulary long after their original languages would have been forgotten by ordinary Russian speakers. The word Stürmen, for navigator, comes from the German Steuermann. Matros, for sailor, comes from the Dutch Matroos. Korabel, the common word for ship, has ancient Slavic roots but was shaped by centuries of contact with the maritime vocabulary of Byzantium and Western Europe. Even the word flot, for fleet, is a borrowing from the Dutch vloot, which Peter's shipbuilders would have used as naturally as Russian. These linguistic traces are a kind of archaeology, evidence of the encounters, absorptions and adaptations that built the Russian naval tradition from its heterogeneous beginnings into something distinctively its own. The Dutch and English shipbuilders who came to Russia at Peter's invitation left their words in the language just as they left their techniques in the shipyards, and those words are still spoken today by sailors who may have no idea of their origin, who use them as simply and naturally as they use any other part of the Russian they were born into. The sea has occupied a particular place in Russian literature and music and painting that reflects the Navy's role in Russian national consciousness, not the dominant role it plays in British or American culture, but a significant and resonant one. Pushkin wrote of the sea with a yearning that his biography suggests was personal. He was a man of the interior who had seen the Black Sea only briefly, but who returned to it in his poetry with the longing of someone who understood what it represented: freedom, distance, the possibility of another life. His poem, To the Sea, written in 1824, is one of the most beautiful things in the Russian language, and it addresses the sea as a living presence, a force of nature that embodies everything that bureaucratic Russia denied. The painter Ivan Ivazovsky, who was born in Feodosia in Crimea in 1817, and who lived until 1900, created thousands of paintings of the sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Arctic, many of them depicting naval battles from Russian history. His Ninth Wave, painted in 1850, is one of the most famous paintings in Russian art, showing a group of shipwreck survivors clinging to debris as an enormous wave rises over them in the dawn light. It is an image that combines the specific texture of the sea that Aiwazowski had observed for decades with a universal statement about human endurance in the face of overwhelming natural force, and it has never lost its power. Rimsky-Korsakov, who served as a naval officer before he became a composer, wrote the sea into his music in ways that are still immediately recognizable. The opening of Scheherazade, with its rocking bass lines and its sense of vastness and possibility, draws directly on his experience as a sailor in the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific. He was one of the few Russian composers who knew the sea not as a metaphor but as a physical reality, and the authenticity of that knowledge gives his oceanic music a quality that composition from the study could not replicate. The history of the Russian Navy, spread across more than 1,000 years and encompassing every extreme of human experience from the most glorious victory to the most complete catastrophe, teaches several things that transcend the specific story of one nation's relationship with the water. It teaches that geography shapes ambition, but it does not determine it. Russia's geography made a great navy difficult, expensive, and strategically complicated. But geography did not make it impossible, and the desire to overcome those geographic limitations drove some of the most extraordinary acts of will and ingenuity in Russian history. Peter the Great working in a Dutch shipyard, the fleet of Gangut sailing through the ice-filled Baltic, Ushakov's squadron rounding the tip of Europe to fight in the Mediterranean, the 2nd Pacific Squadron's 18,000-mile voyage to disaster, the nuclear submarines threading through the ice of the Arctic. All of them represent the same basic act, the refusal to be stopped by the accident of where one was born. It teaches that institutions matter more than individual genius, that even the most brilliant admiral is only as effective as the system that trains him, supports him, and maintains the ships under his command. The Russian Navy has had moments of extraordinary individual achievement, but it has also had long periods when the institutional foundations crumbled, and the individual excellence of specific officers could not compensate for the decay of the whole. The lesson of Tsushima, and of the Kursk, and of the chaos of the early Soviet period is the same lesson. Ships and men are not enough. The system that produces them, maintains them, and gives them clear strategic direction is what determines whether they will be effective or merely brave, and it teaches something about the sea itself, that vast, indifferent, beautiful, terrible element that has been the backdrop to all of this history. The sea does not care about Russian ambitions, or about any nation's ambitions. It has swallowed fleets and returned their timbers to the shore. It has preserved the bodies of the drowned in its cold darkness for centuries. It has been, simultaneously, the highway of trade and the highway of war, the path to empire and the path to destruction, the place where men found freedom and the place where they found death. Every navy in history has learned this, and every generation of sailors has had to learn it again, because it is not the kind of knowledge that can be fully transmitted by instruction. It has to be felt in the body, in the gut response to a changing sea, in the particular quality of light on water in the early morning before a battle, in the smell of the spray at the bow of a ship moving into the open ocean. The sailors of Kievan Rus felt it. So did the galley slaves of Peter's Azov fleet, and the veterans of Chesma, and the doomed men of Tsushima, and the submariners of the Cold War who descended into the Arctic darkness and came back to the light. It is the common thread, the thing that connects all of them across the centuries, the thing that makes their story, finally, a single story, stretching from the brown rivers of ancient Rus to the deep blue water of the present day,